Good morning. Welcome to the first day of two public witness hearings being held here for non-tribal government programs under the jurisdiction of the Interior Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. And I'm pleased to be joined by the former chair of this committee, still a great member, Congressman Michael Simpson of Idaho, as well as our Vice Chair, Congresswoman Shelley Pingree of Maine. Now, you might have noticed there was a little commotion before I put down the gavel. We were out in the hall really quick. So I'd like you all to give a warm welcome to a visiting delegation of the Parliament of Georgia. We appreciate your interest in our legislative process, and we hope you find our hearing instructive because it's very important to this committee that we support our public lands, our arts, the things that make America so very special. Last year, yeah, please. Everybody was being so quiet and so polite. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but thank you for welcoming our guests. Last year, when I became chair of the subcommittee, I brought back the important tradition of public witness days for non-tribal programs. And I am pleased today that this hearing, more than 400 witnesses composed of a diverse range of partners, including public, nonprofit organizations, state and local governments, will have an opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. Today, we will hear about numerous topics related to the jurisdiction of this subcommittee, including the arts and the humanities, environment, public lands, and wildlife. I'm eager to learn more about each of your priorities, and I look forward to our discussions that we have on these issues because I believe it will help all of us on this committee be more informed while we begin to develop the 2021 appropriations bill. Before I turn to Mr. Simpson, I'd like to cover a few hearing logistics, however. We will call each panel of witnesses to the table one at a time, and as you can see, our first panel, gold stars, right here. Each witness will have 5 minutes to present their testimony, and we will be using a time tracker to track the time. As I pointed out, we have 40 witnesses, so we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So when the light turns yellow, you have 1 minute remaining, and we would like you to please conclude your remarks. When the light blinks red, I will lightly gavel. It's a light gavel, it's not a heavy one. And ask you to please conclude your remarks so the next witness can begin. Now, each witness needs to know we have their written statements, and I've been reading through them. So everything will be in the record. So don't feel pressure or rush to get everything covered orally in your 5 minutes. After we hear the testimony of each witness on the panel, members will have an opportunity to ask questions. So get ready. We ask really good questions. And I'd like to remind those who are joining us in the hearing room that the committee rules prohibit the use of cameras and audio equipment during the hearing by individuals without House-issued press credentials. After this morning's hearing concludes, we will adjourn and reconvene at 1 o'clock this afternoon for the hearing. So at this time, I am honored and very happy to yield to my dear friend, Mr. Simpson from Idaho.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for calling this important hearing to get input from the public on a wide array of programs under this subcommittee's jurisdiction. Mr. Joyce and I, along with other members of the subcommittee, look forward to working with you in the days and weeks ahead to do what we can to evaluate the effectiveness of these programs and to make the difficult but necessary choices among competing priorities. Like the chair, I'd like to take a minute to extend a warm welcome to all of our witnesses and to the delegation from the Parliament of Georgia who are sitting in the audience. Since we have a full day ahead of us, I'm happy to yield back, and I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you. There will be a portion of the testimony where I will have to step out and attend another hearing, but the vice chair, who has many other arts titles here at the U.S. Congress, will be ably ready to assist in taking the remaining testimony. So with that, we have our first panel, Mr. Ben Folds, Pam Burex, Ms. Ben Kane, and Stephanie Aracho. Beautiful name. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm just going to let you introduce your arts organization so we have more times for questions. Mr. Folds.
Great. Here with the Americans for the Arts.
You might.
Oh, we turned this on? Is that on?
There you go.
Oh, Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the Americans for the Arts and the NEA, something that's very important to me. I was here speaking to your committee a year ago, and I wish more people could see this side of DC. It's really nice to see you all working together on something that's important to everybody, and it gave me some fuel to go back out and do it again for a year, something that I do as advocacy for arts. I've submitted written testimony for the record that presents arguments we know are effective in making the case for the National Endowment for the Arts. State that I'm asking for at least $170 million for the National Endowment for the Arts for the 2021 fiscal year. You all know this, but it's worth noting for the public watching that this request just brings us to the 1994 levels of investment for the NEA. It's not a big ask for something that is very important. I began my career as a rock and roll recording artist 30 years ago, making albums and touring every corner of the U.S. It's kind of like I'm on constant campaigning. I've just talked to people. I'm everywhere and talk to everybody. For the past 15 years, a big part of my career has been performing with symphony orchestras in cities big and small. I just got back from performing 2 nights with the Minnesota Symphony. I performed with the Utah Symphony in Salt Lake in April. I do that regularly. Tacoma Symphony Orchestra in November. I've done them all. One of my great experiences was Cleveland's Contemporary Youth Orchestra. And that's a total NEA success story. That is wonderful. It's 100 kids, all walks of life, and they're fantastic. They play all original music. I did 5 seasons of primetime NBC music television. I'm about to embark on a TV series for Fred Rogers Productions, composing songs with children. I'm the artistic advisor to the National Symphony Orchestra at the Kennedy Center, where my mission is to bring younger audiences to experience the symphony, important part of our culture. It means a lot to me. At my own gigs, I tell each audience that the symphony orchestra is the artistic symbol for civilization, which I believe is very true. You're seeing 50, 60, 100 people on stage working together. The rhetoric that we use every day in concert, in harmony, those are all symbols of the symphony orchestra. And the symbols matter to me. That's why we take care with our flag. I'm a cold, hard capitalist, you should know, who is grateful for the competitive environment in which I succeeded, because it pushed me creatively and it pushed me personally. So I come to you as an artist, an arts advocate, but also a small business owner, because in rock music, the van runs out of gas and you're done, 0-0. Small business owner knows the difference between spending and investing. If you spend too much, you fail. But in order to succeed, you got to invest. And that is what the NEA is to me, is a great investment. It's felt most profoundly in rural areas where an NEA dollar results in $9 in matching funds from the private sector. That's the kind of investment that satisfies the cold, hard capitalist in myself. But the invaluable, irreplaceable service that the NEA offers most has to do with access to the arts. That's the important part to me. It's the access and access for everyone. It's hard to do any other way. It's not as much about supporting the arts, which is important, but it's about finding ways for the arts to support and help us. It's putting the arts to work, and you see that every day if you tour as much as I do. For profound examples of this, I don't have to draw from my professional career. I live in a small Hudson Valley river town. It's as small as a postage stamp. It's just a few blocks wide and deep. We have a very diverse population, as you'll ever see. It's like what seems like Kentucky, rural countryside, is sitting right next to Brooklyn. It's all together. But sadly, despite the proximity, there's not a lot of mingling. Different blocks, different stores, different churches, despite all our best intentions. Just last December, I attended a fun little concert. It involved children, it involved local professional performers, musicians, and dances. It was just so cool. I don't normally like stuff like this, but it was awesome. Kids from all the neighborhoods got together, sung together, the parents mingled, everyone had a good time. It's the first time I saw everyone together. I looked at the program made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. And they nailed it. They nail it all the time. And the people in the community made it work all the way to whatever level this has to come down from. We have a lot of arts money in Hudson, but I've never seen it bring people together like that. I think I'm out of time. So I'm just going to say that 170 million is not 50 cents on a year per person. It's not quite 50 cents. Over my lifetime, I see it increase at $1 per capita. Thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Please.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Chairwoman McCullum, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the committee. Today, members Pingree and Simpson, thank you for your invitation to deliver this testimony today regarding federal appropriations for the National Endowment for the Arts. My name is Pam Bro, and I serve as President and CEO of the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. We're NASA, the organization that represents and serves the nation's 56 state and jurisdictional arts agencies. And today I'm here to thank the committee, to thank the members for their tremendous support of the Arts Endowment, and urge the committee to consider funding it at $170 million in fiscal 21. In the recent funding bill passed by Congress, this subcommittee supported an increase in funding for the agency. The states and NASA are extremely grateful for this. We recognize that committee members work together in a bipartisan manner to support the endowment and its important contributions to our country. Through its highly effective federal-state partnership, the endowment contributes 40% of its programmatic funds to state, jurisdictional, and regional arts agencies each year. That resulting $49 million in fiscal 19 helped to empower states and regions to address their priorities. Unique among federal agencies, the endowment funds state plans. These plans are developed by state arts agencies in response to citizens, communities, arts organizations, legislatures, and governors. That makes the federal state arts investment incredibly responsive and relevant to citizens. The report accompanying the last Appropriations Act affirmed Congress' support for this important partnership and its corresponding 40% allocation, and we thank the committee for this acknowledgement. State arts agencies use their share of endowment funds, combined with funds from state legislatures, to support about 22,000 grants to arts and civic organizations and schools in more than 4,500 communities. 22% of the grant awards go to non-metropolitan areas, supporting programs that benefit rural America. And 26% of state grant dollars go to arts education, fostering student success in and out of school. Congress' continued support of the 40% formula is essential to state arts agencies, boosting their ability to ensure that the arts benefit all communities, regardless of wealth or geography. In response to an increased demand for arts programming for older Americans, for example, the Minnesota State Arts Board recently provided training for teaching artists to learn how to design and implement high-quality arts education programs specifically for older adults. With the total number of older adults in Minnesota expected to double between 2010 and 2030, creative aging programming is a key strategy for fostering positive aging and healthier lives, and the State Arts Board's program will ensure that Minnesota artists are trained to provide these vital services. In an additional example, the Ohio Arts Council demonstrates its commitment to all the people of the state by successfully fulfilling its Fund Every County initiative. Now, all 88 counties in the state have received arts funding in response to their needs. Should Congress support an increase for the Arts Endowment, state arts agencies will be in a position to expand their meaningful work to help communities thrive as fulfilling and productive places to live, conduct business, visit, and raise families. NASA and state arts agencies also applaud the Arts Endowment's many services to the country, including its leadership in developing noteworthy programs for communities, military personnel, veterans, students, and so many others. We proudly partner with the endowment and work collaboratively with them to benefit all communities across the country, because together we can accomplish what neither side can achieve alone. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today. We look forward at NASA to continuing to work productively with this committee, and we stand ready to serve as a resource to you. Thanks.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Madam Chair and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to present testimony on behalf of the State Humanities Councils, the state affiliates of the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Beth Kane, and I am director of the Norway Memorial Library in Norway, Maine. My institution has received no fewer than 24 grants from the Maine Humanities Council. I am here to request $170 million for the National Endowment for the Humanities for fiscal year 2021 and $54 million for the federal-state partnership, which provides allocations by formula to the 56 humanities councils. Because this request is so important, I'd like to tell you what the State Humanities Council support has done for Norway and other rural communities across our country. Norway, Maine is a town of about 5,000 people in southern Oxford County between Little Androscoggin River and the western foothills of the Mahoosic Range of the White Mountains. The Norway Memorial Library has a staff of 6 and serves over 40,000 visitors a year. Our most recent annual report records program attendance of 6,301. As in so many towns across rural America, the library in Norway is an anchor cultural and educational institution and plays a central role in the life of the community. The Maine Humanities Council has been our valued partner for more than 30 years. Through grant funding and program partnerships, the Council has helped to shape how we understand our work and clarify our vision for the kinds of intellectual and cultural opportunities we offer. In partnership with the Maine Humanities Council, the library has been home to popular book discussion programs for the general public and for low literacy adults who may have never dreamed they'd be part of a book group. Other offerings include lectures, theatrical presentations, and community discussion programs. To give just one example, in 2013, the library was awarded a Bridging Cultures Muslim Journeys bookshelf by the American Library Association and the NEH. We turned to the Maine Humanities Council for financial support for cultural programming, including speakers, musicians, a film screening, and scholars to help lead book discussions. This year, several Norway organizations will come together to plan events for the state's bicentennial. The library and the Norway Historical Society will seek council support for programs as part of this series. Time and again, we've seen hunger for this kind of programming, and it is no small thing when a discussion series on race and justice in America brings in 89 people over 5 discussions, or 52 people attend a talk by an Iranian immigrant sharing his family's story of building a life in Maine. These experiences have lasting impact on the life of the community. Maine Humanities Council programs and grants enable people in my town and across to access cultural and lifelong learning opportunities that the library simply could not provide on its own. The work of our State Humanities Council levels the playing field so that my small town library can offer experiences equal in intellectual depth and breadth to those found in America's biggest cities. I'm very proud that the Norway Memorial Library is a valuable resource for the people of my community. But I'm not here today because my library is special. I'm here because libraries serving communities like mine are partnering with their state humanities councils in every corner of America. What I have described in Norway is a microcosm of the impact State Humanities Council support has had on individuals and neighborhoods across our country. The councils make humanities programs possible in places where a small grant of several hundred to a few $1,000s can make an enormous difference. The councils, along with the NEH, are now looking ahead to the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, an event that offers Americans the opportunity to renew our understanding of our founding principles, explore how they have been both challenged and reinforced, give voice to marginalized stories and communities, and deepen understanding of our collective history and the pillars of democracy. The State Humanities Councils can help make the next 5 years a time when we rededicate ourselves to strengthening civics education and reinvigorating our ability to work through differences. My written testimony describes a wide range of programs made possible by state humanities councils in communities large and small in every corner of this nation where residents are talking with each other about issues that matter. The state councils are well positioned to effectively put to use the $54 million we are requesting through federal state partnership. Thank you for this opportunity. you have given me to testify, for the support you have provided over the years, and for the important work of the State Humanities Councils and the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Thank you. This panel, and I know we have another speaker, but I set it up going in this direction. So we've heard from the Assembly of State Art Agencies, we've heard from Americans from the Arts, and we've heard from the Endowment for the Humanities. And now we're going to hear from a very, very special American, one who not only shared her story, but her uncle's story, and how the arts and the humanities make it possible for us to say thank you for your service. Please introduce yourself for the record.
My name is Stephanie Aracho, and I'm a student at Jefferson Community College in Watertown, New York. Good morning. Thank you to the subcommittee for inviting me today to testify today. I am pleased to testify in support of the National Endowment for Humanities on behalf of the National Humanities Alliance. As I said, I'm a student at Jefferson Community College, home to Fort Drum. I am a retired Navy veteran and aircraft mechanic by trade. I deployed 12 times, including a 7-month deployment to Iraq and a 13-month deployment to Afghanistan. In 2018, the college offered a class for combat veterans called Dialogues of Honor and Sacrifice. The class, made possible by National Endowment for Humanities grant, was intended to teach the history, literature, and art of the civil Vietnam and Iraq wars. I was drawn to this course because I wanted to better understand my uncle's experience. He's an Army veteran who had been shot twice during the Vietnam War and was awarded 2 Purple Hearts. I remember my uncle as being intimidating, quiet, and a scary man who wanted nothing to do with me. We hadn't spoken more than 2 full sentences to one another by the time I left to join the Navy in 1996. Nonetheless, I visited my uncle every chance I could during my time in the Navy, but nothing was as special as the visits after I experienced real combat deployments. Now, seeing me as a fellow combat veteran, he let down his guard, he smiled, laughed, and even joked around. My uncle was now able to talk even just a little bit about his experience in Vietnam. Knowing I could relate, he let me see his guilty pain that he had been harboring for years, guilty for wanting to be proud of wearing his Army uniform, even after being spat on when he stepped off the plane, guilty for being able to come back home to his family unlike so many brothers who lost their lives in front of him. It was not until another tour in Afghanistan that I grew more like my uncle. When I returned, I began to self-medicate with alcohol or was working out 6 times a week for about 2 hours a day to the point of exhaustion. My relationship with my husband, my children, my family were severely strained. My children, especially my oldest, were afraid of me when I got angry. I could not wrap my head around why I felt lost, alone, and misunderstood. It was in the midst of these challenges that I had the opportunity to take the Dialogues of Honor and Sacrifice course. And while I hoped the focus on the Vietnam War would help me understand more about my uncle, I didn't realize how it would affect me, how it would help me as well. The course began 2 weeks before JCC's 2018 fall semester with a week-long trip that took both professors and students to Gettysburg, Arlington National Cemetery, and Washington, D.C. We learned the history of the sites and bonded quickly. Although we were strangers, we entrusted in one another, taking turns talking and listening. Sometimes no words needed to be spoken, only the presence of a fellow combat soldier who understood. Fall semester began with a trip still fresh in our minds, and we dove straight into the history of all 3 wars. We studied contrasts and similarities between the 3 wars, but to our amazement, we realized that these soldiers were not so different from us. Experiences in Vietnam, the battle, and the firefights in Iraq were also similar. As veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, we could relate to stories from a Civil War soldier. This camaraderie across decades, across conflicts, was amazing. It was a special bond that most could never fathom. Our focus shifted to poetry, literature, music, and art as we read Here Bullet, a book of short poems. Our task was to create our own poem, intimidating at first, but became a touching, lasting experience. A liberating sense of freedom to open your heart, pour every brutal emotion onto paper so that readers can experience your reality. When we moved to the Things They Carry by Tim O'Brien, it became everyone's favorite because every student carried something special in their combat war zone. We related to one another across different branches of military, different theaters of war, and even drastically different duties while at war. Moving towards the last 2 weeks of the course, we entered the world of art. Each student was given a blank masquerade mask to decorate it as we saw ourselves. The introspection and self-evaluation produced every raw emotion I've ever felt as they flooded onto my mask. The syllabus surely did not reflect therapy or liberation as a goal, but it helped me face my past with the realization that none of us are alone in the battle of normalcy. The curriculum allowed everyone to engage and challenge one another. They forced everyone to try different perspectives and even think differently than they normally may. During the last week of course, we had a privilege of speaking with 2 Vietnam veterans. My initial drive for pursuing this program was upon me, trying to understand my uncle, hoping to learn how to bond with him. I learned horrific details from these Vietnam veterans, but ones I wanted to hear. Ones I knew would help me relate to my uncle, but I also began to realize that searching for a better understanding about my uncle was not as impossible as I thought. Our lives and experience paralleled each other at times, occasionally even mirrored one another. My experience were less gruesome and less drastic, but in the end, he and I carried the same demon from war. We are kept awake at night for the same reasons. Through a combination of course and therapy, my night terrors have lessened dramatically. Anxiety attacks are almost gone. I still avoid big crowds, but I have learned to work through my fears. My relationship with my family, both immediate and extended, have improved and no longer strained. For the first time in my life, I've been at peace with myself and no longer self-medicate to drown out the noises in my head. I am so grateful for the opportunity I had to take this course and appreciate the support the subcommittee has offered NEH in recent years, making programs like this possible. To ensure that more veterans and all Americans can benefit from humanities as I did, I ask that you fund the NEH at $170 million for the fiscal year of 2021. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. And the MASS program is something that I've seen that we've worked with other arts organizations, Americans for the Arts. So thank you so much for your testimony. Ms. Pingree, do you have a question for the panelists?
So many, but you want me to keep it short?
I can tap light.
Okay. Well, first, Madam Chair, thank you. This is a wonderful panel. I know it's going to be a great morning of panelists, but this is really a great, as you said, sort of transition between looking at the big picture. And thank you so much for sharing your personal story that's just really profound about, I don't think any of us could say it better about how the arts can impact an individual, a family, and obviously the community you took the course with. That's really great, and I really appreciate you sharing so much with us. And to all of you, thank you. Of course, we're great fans of Americans for the Arts, and really appreciate all that they do in a national perspective on all of this, and for you to make this part of your career. It's really beneficial. We love the state associations for the arts, and it's important to us. And Beth, thank you so much for coming from the state of Maine. I'm honored to have you here. And of course, if you lived in the state of Maine, there's only 1.3 million people, and we joke we're just a small town with very long roads. And of course, Beth and I hadn't seen each other for a very long time, and then we realized that we were closely connected by our husband, and that's just how it is in Maine. You know everyone one way or the other. So, and thank you for the great work. I really appreciated the fact that you brought it home to all of us that in every small rural town there isn't sufficient funds, there aren't sufficient funds to support the kinds of works that the NEA and the NEH do, and I don't think people realize how profound that is, the number of people who would come in to hear the experience of an Iranian immigrant, or to come in and talk about race and many challenges that are faced in every single community, and you all really brought that out about how the arts can bring us all together. So I'm obviously making a statement, not asking a question, but just quickly, because I won't have as much time as I'd like, but is there more that you could do? I mean, I hope we can fund it at $170 million, and based on all your testimony, we should be doing this at $170 billion. I don't know, it should be twice that, right? Yeah. Okay, but as you said, I think less than 50 cents a person. I think this is a contribution we would all make, seeing the work that you did. But just quickly share with us, what could you do if you had a little more money, and why is it so important in a community like Norway? Because I'm assuming you wouldn't find these funds in the community's budget.
We would not. We have great support in our community, but a lot of it is not necessarily financial support. We could always do more. We try to keep in your back pocket availability and openness to programs that come our way. We are always keeping our eyes and ears open. Can't do everything on a shoestring. We have very generous authors and professionals in Maine who come to libraries, but money always helps. What we find is the cultural aspect. Discussing a book is one thing, but when you can actually bring in speakers or musicians or taste the food or hear more in depth, it grows and expands that experience for everyone in the community. That frequently takes money that we don't necessarily have.
Well, thank you. I would love to ask you all a question, but I know I'll get in trouble. So, but thank you so much. You really gave great testimony this morning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for being here to testify. This is an area that I think is very important, and I think it is bipartisan between Republicans and Democrats. Several years ago, I said, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, we had one of the directors for the NEA out in Idaho. In fact, I think I've had the last 4 out to Idaho. We had last summer, we had Mary Ann Carter out and toured the state for a few days and stopped at local arts councils and everything. I said, you know what we need to do is find a plan where we can project 5 years ahead where we'd like to double the investment in the arts and humanities and put that on a glide path somehow, as they did in 1994 when they said they wanted to double NIH funding over a 5-year period, and they did it. When you look at our total budget and stuff, $170 million is not all that much money. But they do incredible work in communities all across this country, and it's been, as I said, my pleasure to have the directors of both the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities out to the state. In fact, I had the director for the National Endowment for the Humanities bring to Boise one day when I was there about 10 or 12 of people who had gotten grants that the state had given grants to, and we sat around the table and he sat and they each talked about what they were doing and why they were doing it and so forth. It's fascinating stuff. But it is very important. Pam, you mentioned 40% of the $170 million, if you got that, goes to the states. Is that true, Beth? The same in the humanities? What's the split between state and?
I haven't done the percentage. That sounds about right, but it's 54. Yes. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
Is
She's done
that
her homework?
is that the right split?
Yeah, it's about they parallel to my humanities. Yeah, they are parallel.
So is that the right split?
It is. I think it's an important split. 40% is meaningful and goes a long way to match state dollars for important programming. And it's also meaningful that the National Endowment for the Arts retains 60% of its funding at the national level because it allows arts organizations across the country to compete in a national pool. And those who are able to do that find incredible leverage within that to go out and raise other resources for programming.
And I think it's probably true of most of us is that, you know, I'm not worried about the arts in New York or the arts in Washington or the arts in Los Angeles. I'm worried about the arts in Salmon, Idaho.
Right.
And how do we make sure that we continue to support the arts communities in rural America?
Right.
That don't have access to a lot of these things. So it's been fantastic what they've been doing. I hope they continue it. I've always questioned whether 60-40 was the right split or whatever, and I don't know what it is. But I know that my wife is on the Idaho Falls Arts Council, and there's one person I do have to satisfy in this world, and so I do whatever I can. So.
One additional note on the importance of the investment on the federal side and on the 60% side is it allows both the endowments, I think, to invest in new work that then can have a major ripple effect. And a prime example of that would be both endowments' investments in arts and humanities and military.
Yeah.
Right? It's both the endowments that began those pilots that have led to so much important work now going on across the country in arts and humanities to benefit members of the military, and that had to be tested and created someplace. And it's the leadership shown at both endowments that enabled that to happen. So that's another important part of a strong investment on the federal side, that leadership and what they
And
what
Beth,
they do
last
with
year
the
we had
dollars.
you talked about the authors, and the Idaho Humanities Council brings out authors and does a lecture in North Idaho and Southeast Idaho and Southwestern Idaho, and they've been fascinating. And ever since I've started going to those when I can get out of here and go to them, it's cost me a lot of money because then I support the humanities. And last year we had Douglas Brinkley that wrote Moonshot. And listening to him talk about it all is just fantastic. So anyway, Stephanie, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it very much.
We are, as I mentioned, I have another committee that I'm going to be going to later, and it's the one that oversees the defense money. And we're having the Department of Defense, now that the humanities and the arts have proven ways in which to help our servicemen and women heal, recover, be resilient, be strong. They're stepping up to the plate in order to free up more dollars for more opportunities to work with our communities at large. And when you help a veteran, you help their family. And I say that as a daughter of a veteran. So, but Mr. Foltz, I want to know, when you mentioned working on this project with the Rogers Foundation with kids, my kids had an artist in residence, and the peanut butter and jelly sandwich song has not left my head since you mentioned that. So will you help me think about something else today and just kind of tell me where you're going to go? What are some of the goals and aspirations? Because I think it's really important to get in the schools and for kids to understand music is language, music is math,
Exactly.
music is
Yeah.
transformative.
Yeah, I mean, the angle of the show that I'm doing with the Rogers Foundation is music as communication first and foremost. I mean, it's the human brain works that way. You know, if a little kid says, I want to go home, it's like, okay, we've got a song. You do that 3 times. You know? We begin to think it's something that is, doing it as an art is great. It's hijacking something that we already do in communication. And if you can teach a kid that and not intimidate them too badly at the beginning about, are you going to be a musician, or are you going to be proficient at it or not? When you learn art as painting, the first thing you do when you're a little kid is you do something that's an original piece that came out of you. When you do music, not so much. You're usually learning dead German music, and I think it's really important to do both. But this show is an attempt to, and it's been really successful so far in the pilots that we've done. The kids have all kinds of ideas. We have a group of, behind me, we will have a student group of musicians that are a little bit older so they can see that you could get good. Plus, I give them the riff. So if a kid has said, I want to go home, I'm like, okay, Hart plays this, you play this, and now say what you just said. And they say it, and they sing it, and they come up with new ideas. So it's, I think it's good because it's not for kids who are going to grow up and be musicians. It's for kids to grow up and have an idea of how to speak publicly, how to organize their lives, how to connect abstract and critical thinking together. And it's, I'm inspired by it.
Well, I want to thank the first panel for setting the table literally up here for what we're going to hear the rest of the morning this afternoon. Thank you very much. Thank you, Stephanie.
Yeah, my line is always that I think music is the bookmarks of our lives. I don't care where you go. If you're driving down the road and a song comes on, great job. Back to exactly the same place. You mark your life by that.
She had pretty severe aphasia with this area. It's a very small part of your brain.
So we're going to do so rather than everybody introduce twice. I'm just going to have them introduce themselves.
It was getting late in the game. She was late in the rehab. Until they reconnected neuro.
I think everybody's pretty.
Does it matter where we sit?
No, I wish I was, but I was not.
Yeah, but I took it out of order because I wanted Stephanie to be the closer last time.
Like all the kids. Thank you. I shaved before I went to the hospital for 10 years.
It's always a good sign when people are still talking after a panel's left. But we need to, I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so I'm going to, because we are already a little behind, we're not going to introduce everybody twice. I'm just going to let you folks take it. You've sat in order, and introduce yourself and your organization, because we want to have time for questions. So, please. If the little
There
red
we go.
light's on.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. It's hard to follow that last panel. That was pretty moving and very exhilarating. On a personal note, I'll start with I'm Cameron Onley. I'm the Director for U.S. Policy and Government Relations at the Nature Conservancy. And on a personal note, as I was sitting there listening to your last panelists, I was thinking of my daughter who's 12, and she's literally going through a test right now on the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. And it's just been so fun for me to tell her that I'm coming up here to talk to you, really exercising democracy. I wish she could be with me here today, but she is taking a science test also. So, but just thank you. It's really timely for me. So, Chairwoman McCollum, Congressman Simpson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to submit our recommendations, the Nature Conservancy's recommendations for fiscal year 2021. The Nature Conservancy is an international organization. We're in all 50 states, but also around the world, working to protect ecologically important lands, waters for people and nature. Building on the themes that you heard from our last panel, you know, the nature really unites people. We see that across the country. It brings people together to work on issues they care deeply about in their community. It also heals people. We've seen more and more science where we've seen veterans use our rivers, use our parks, use our nature to really heal after some very traumatic events. We'd like to thank you all on the committee for the work that we do over the years with policy initiatives on the ground. Chairman McCollum, you have been just a champion for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I cannot thank you enough for that. Increasing the funding for the conservation, not just for your home state, but for things for projects around the world, or around the country, nationwide. I also wanted to recognize Ranking Member Joyce's continued support for the Great Lakes Initiative. It's been great. Each one of you have done work with us, the Nature Conservancy, in your home states, but also nationwide. Cannot thank you enough. We have a lot of it in our submitted testimonies. I can't highlight it all, so I apologize for that. We have to be brief. Those were just two examples of where we've worked with you. As we enter the fiscal year 2021 budget cycle and likely another challenging fiscal environment, the Conservancy wishes to thank all of you for the 2020 programs and the support there. Our budget recommendations that we submitted to you in full reflect a balanced approach from the funding levels that we've seen in prior years. The fiscal year 2020 spending package dedicated $495 million to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Thank you. This is a fund that has seen strong bipartisan support, again, that bringing people together. And the Conservancy appreciates Congress's commitment to the funding of important projects on the ground and the recreational projects that program delivers across the country. The Conservancy this year is supporting $900 million full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. We're looking forward to that. We're also looking forward to working with all of you to see a permanent funding fix for that program. We strongly support funding for habitat and wildlife conservation investments like the Cooperative Endangered Species Fund and the State and Tribal Wildlife Grants Program. These and other investments are essential to ensuring that we take strategic actions to prevent species from being listed as threatened or endangered. Notably, the Conservancy requests continued investment in ongoing efforts to restore and conserve sagebrush habitat and the greater sage grouse across federal, state, tribal, and private lands. These resources are needed to implement on-the-ground projects and monitor habitat treatments, address fire, invasive grasses, and facilitate the partnerships and the science needed for effective conservation. We also urge the subcommittee to continue its support for programs that focus on specific geographic areas. I mentioned the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, but the EPA's programs and the Chesapeake Bay, Puget Sound, Long Island Sound, Gulf of Mexico programs, all of those contribute to protecting habitat, water quality in a large landscape scale. These programs have a proven record of supporting the state's voluntary restoration efforts, and the Conservancy urges the committee to continue to support strong fiscal year 2020 funding for these programs. I'll close by thanking all of you for the continued work to address wildfires. Did the light go on? Wildfire funding. Congress took major steps to stabilize the Department of Agriculture's Forest Service as well as the Department of Interior's budgets with the 2018 fire fix. However, the fire fix will only be fully successful without substantial reinvestment in the programs that help those forests be resilient. Strategic, proactive hazardous fuel and restoration treatments have proven to be safe and cost-effective in reducing risks and leaving forests in a more natural condition, resilient to those wildfires. Again, thank you for the opportunity to be here and to submit the Nature Conservancy's recommendations for fiscal year 2021.
Thank you. I'm Kate Van Waas, Executive Director of American Hiking Society. Chair McCullum and members of the subcommittee, on behalf of American Hiking Society and the Trails Move People Coalition, I thank the committee for the opportunity to provide testimony today on the vital importance of adequately funding our nation's trails and public lands to ensure access for all. This is about more than preserving precious ecological and cultural treasures. Children's outside playtime is shrinking, and the gap between the diversity of our nation and the diversity of those spending time outdoors is widening, resulting in measurable detriment to mental and physical health and development. We cannot afford to push trail funding to the sidelines. American Hiking Society is the only national nonprofit organization dedicated to empowering all, and I stress all, to enjoy, share, and preserve the hiking experience. We envision a world where everyone feels welcome in the hiking community and has permanent access to meaningful hiking. Our efforts ensure funding for hiking trails, the preservation of natural areas, and expansion of access to and inclusion in outdoor recreation. American Hiking Society has mobilized over 558,000 trail volunteers to construct and maintain 41,000 miles of trails on federal and state public lands at a value of over $108 million in labor. I'm also testifying today on behalf of the newly formed Trails Move People Coalition. The member organizations of the coalition represent millions of Americans who spend their time, money, and energy to get out on trails for recreation and volunteer activities. I thank the subcommittee for, in recent years, leading congressional efforts to provide incremental increases in funding that benefit trails and the hiking community, and I encourage continued progress and know I'm speaking to friends today. I will highlight a few of these funding priorities today with the full list of recommendations provided in my written statement. We are grateful to the subcommittee for providing increased funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund in fiscal year 2020. Like the Nature Conservancy, we are urging full funding at $900 million. The LWCF protects and makes accessible much of our nation's trails, public lands, parks, and open spaces. One great example is the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program. This innovative program has made real progress in expanding access to outdoor spaces for urban communities, especially urban communities of color, whose access to and inclusion in outdoor recreation have been disproportionately negatively impacted by geography, socioeconomic status, and other factors. Along with full LWCF funding, passage of the Outdoors for All Act will help programs like Outdoor Recreation Legacy thrive. Hiking, simply walking along a trail, be it urban or wild, poses the fewest participation barriers of almost any outdoor activity. But it requires trails, paved and unpaved, and trails don't build and maintain themselves. That requires human labor and federal funding. Specifically, for the Forest Service, which is responsible for over 80% of all federally managed trails in the U.S., we recommend funding the Capital Improvement and Maintenance Trails budget at $100 million, which will allow the completion of annual maintenance needs and begin addressing the huge trail maintenance backlog. For the Bureau of Land Management, we urge the creation of a trails-specific line item in their budget. The BLM manages over 13,000 miles of trails, traversing a rich diversity of landscapes for hikers, anglers, hunters, and other outdoor enthusiasts. Unlike other federal land managers, though, BLM does not have an individual funding line item for trails, resulting in inconsistent funding levels and a lack of clarity on allocations. For the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we recommend funding for refuge visitor services at just over $74 million. National Wildlife Refuges provide incredible opportunities for outdoor recreation on 11 national scenic and historic trails and 44 national recreation trails, supporting more than 37,000 jobs. In conclusion, the nearly 1 million square miles that comprise U.S. public lands are our most treasured natural, historic, and cultural resource. Whether you're a hiker enjoying the abundance of American trails, which span over 4 times the total length of interstate highways, whether you're a member of the indigenous populations for whom these lands are their ancestral homes, or one of the 145 million outdoor recreation users, our public lands are of incalculable value to hundreds of millions of Americans. As we all strive together to protect these lands and trails and make them accessible and welcoming to all communities for generations to come, Congress must do its part to ensure adequate funding. I thank the committee for holding this Public Witness Day and providing me with the opportunity to give this testimony.
Chair McCollum and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Continental Divide Trail Coalition, a nonprofit organization with the mission to complete, promote, and protect the Continental Divide National Scenic Trail. My name is Amanda Wheelock, and I am the Policy and Communications Manager for the coalition. For those who haven't had the fortune of visiting, the Continental Divide Trail, usually known simply as the CDT, travels 3,100 miles along the spine of the Rocky Mountains, connecting the vibrant red ocotillos of the southern New Mexican desert to the equally brilliant yellow larches of Glacier National Park in northern Montana, as well as countless natural, historical, and cultural treasures in between, including several hundred miles in the 2nd District of Idaho. The Continental Divide Trail Coalition and our members greatly appreciate your previous support for the CDT and the entire national trail system through appropriations to our land management agency partners to build and maintain these trails, and respectfully request that you continue and increase this support as detailed in our written testimony. We are also grateful for your efforts to increase appropriations for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, often referred to as America's Best Conservation Program, and the subject of my testimony today. Statistics abound on the myriad successes of LWCF, but I myself prefer stories to statistics. So, let's imagine ourselves on the CDT for a moment, walking just a few miles outside of Steamboat Springs, Colorado, on a warm summer's day. As we walk, shimmering aspen groves and golden rangelands stretch beyond the horizon in front of us, as does the black pavement of the highway we're walking on. An 18-wheeler whizzes by just 5 or 6 feet away, followed by a long line of cars stuck behind it, cursing and wishing they could get up to Rabbit Ears Pass even quicker than they are now. Here in northern Colorado, due to a lack of public land, the CDT is forced to follow along the shoulder of Highways 14 and 40 for almost 15 miles, tempting no one but the most determined of thru hikers to experience this particular dangerous section of this national scenic trail. Despite more than 4 decades of work by dedicated land management agency staff, nonprofit partners, volunteers, and members of trailside communities, the Continental Divide Trail remains incomplete due to gaps just like this one in public land ownership along its corridor. Without LWCF funding, there is no realistic way to acquire the lands necessary to create a continuous corridor for the trail, leaving what should be a world-class recreational resource with no path to completion. That is why the Continental Divide Trail Coalition respectfully requests $900 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund in fiscal year 2021, because we believe that resources like the Continental Divide National Scenic Trail deserve the protection via LWCF that they were promised. And we're not alone in this belief. A full 98% of small business owners along the CDT support Congress providing dedicated, full funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And just last year, more than 200 of those business owners along the trail went a step further, signing open letters urging their senators and representatives to provide LWCF with full, permanent funding. Residents of Steamboat Springs, which became an official CDT Gateway community in 2018, want dearly to see their section of trail moved off of the highway and made footing of a national scenic trail. The Yampa Valley Community Foundation has provided funding to CDTC to support our work to close the gap. Big Agnes, a multi-million-dollar and much-beloved gear company born out of Steamboat Springs, rallied their entire staff of more than 120 people to relay all 750 miles of the CDT in Colorado to raise awareness of the trail and the need for its completion. and many local residents stand willing and ready to volunteer to build the new trail sections. Steamboat Springs resident Kathleen Lynch perhaps captured their spirit best when she said, "It's so much more than a trail to the people who live here. It feels so much a part of what defines us as a community that protecting it is inherent to what we believe in." The Land and Water Conservation Fund is vital to communities like Steamboat Springs all across the United States, to their economies, to their health, and to their identities. We hope to see you invest in these communities and in our public lands by fully funding LWCF in fiscal year 2021. Thank you for your time today and for your consideration of these important requests.
Good morning. My name is Kathy DeCoster, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm testifying this morning on behalf of the Partnership for the National Trail System, but I wanted to echo what Cameron and others earlier have said about our appreciation for the time you put into these public witness days. It's probably underappreciated or certainly unknown, maybe outside these walls, but we're very grateful that you're listening to the American people for many days. I'm just glad I'm on the early panel. I'm testifying today for the partnership, which represents the 30 congressionally designated national historic and scenic trails that make up the National Trail System. I brought a couple of maps to look at while we're talking, because you may know about the 1 or 2 trails that are in your district or your state, but you may not know that there's at least one national trail in each of the 50 states. Altogether, they're a significant public land resource for the American people worthy of investment. The 19 national historic trails help tell our uniquely American story, from colonial exploration to the forced relocation of Native Americans to the civil rights struggle, and so much more. And the 11 national scenic trails, like Amanda just discussed along the Continental Divide Trail, provide millions of Americans with access to the outdoors over thousands of miles close to home and in remote wilderness areas. Here are some quick statistics to keep in mind. These 30 trails connect with 84 national parks, 89 national forests, 70 national wildlife refuges, over 100 BLM public land areas, and 179 national wilderness areas. The individual national trails and their supporting groups have engaged 129 trail towns, mostly in rural areas, at the local level, and they run near or through 100 major urban areas. So the system is really something we're working to expand, and appreciate the support you all have given. Your ongoing commitment over in the past and last year's appropriation bill has made an enormous difference to this system and to the successful work of trail groups and trail administrators on the ground. It's also worth noting that in 2019, the federal funds invested in the trails leveraged over $13 million in private funding and 1 million volunteer hours that are valued at almost $26 million. So you can be assured that every dollar you appropriate is stretched much farther on the ground. And the partnership is committed to expanding this leveraging power of the national trails. This impressive system of trails is not yet complete, however, as Amanda talked about so effectively. In order to ensure that the national trails serve the American people most effectively, we're requesting investments in FY21 for operations, construction, and maintenance for all 30 trails in the Park Service, the Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, and full funding at $900 million for the Land and Water Conservation Fund, with over $38 million of that allocated for the parks. For the trails. My old job just surfaced, sorry. Everything connects. These funds are critical to ensuring that the integrity of the trails that make up the National Trail System is supported and enhanced now and into the future. Our written testimony includes specific funding requests for the varied needs within the agency operations, construction, and maintenance categories for all 30 trails, and we're happy to dig in later as you put your bill together on those. We also want to extend our gratitude, as others have, for your continued robust investments in the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the annual allocations to specific national trails. We call for full funding for LWCF in FY21 so that the entire $900 million that's deposited into the LWCF account every year can be allocated by Congress, by this subcommittee, to the conservation and recreation programs for which that funding is intended. We understand that within your current budget allocations, this is very challenging. as well as your need to meet all the other programs as has been testified to and will continue to be today. So that said, we were very heartened to see a final LWCF appropriation in FY20 that was the highest in 17 years. We really appreciate that. LWCF funding for the national trails is critical. There continue to be identified needs for land acquisitions along several national trails, totaling almost $40 million in FY21, and the specifics are highlighted in our written testimony. Full funding of LWCF and the allocation of some of those funds to specific trails will give trail managers the tools they need to protect important trail resources and ensure that the national trail system can meet the needs of the American people. Thank you again for allowing us to testify today, and we look forward to working with you as you put your bill together.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much for helping me make the case, along with all the colleagues on this committee, that we need a bigger baseline budget. And thank you for the acknowledgement for what this committee did for LWCF. But we need your help in getting a bigger top line number altogether. And many of the programs that you pointed out, you also want to see an increase in, and that is some of the lines in forest and BLM and park. So altogether, it just puts more pressure on the dollars. And I appreciate also the singling out of some of the trails and some of the connections that you want to do. But as of right now, we're not able to specify anything but putting things in a top line number due to constraints with not having full agreement with my colleagues on the other side of the aisles that we can specify certain trails or certain projects. I'd like to see us do some of that where we can get something completed and done and move on to the next one. But that's a discussion that will continue to take place in this side of the Capitol, but also has to take place on the other side of the Capitol to do that. So thank you. I just want to thank you for helping me make the case where we need to work with a bigger allocation, and for also recognizing not only the testimony that you heard today, and but what we will hear from our tribal brothers and sisters who also work on many of the projects that you're working on together. So I can't thank you enough. I don't have a question for you because you got everything laid out for me to take when I go in and make my argument. So thank you from the top of my heart for helping me make the case that our subcommittee needs a larger allocation, period. And we all want to work together for finding that permanent funding solution for LWCF because that will help this committee in being able to move forward on those joint projects that you so all eloquently put out. Ms. Pingree?
No, I can't really add. And I appreciate your helping people to understand, just beyond this room, that it's the big number that governs everything else. So thanks for everyone's hard work and doing all that we can. I get to work with almost all of you except the Continental Divide, which is way too far away. But anyway, it's a wonderful part of the trail system. And thanks for providing this map. It's really impressive to see what all of them are. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And on a note, having worked on environmental policy for many, many years, Peter, we like you, but I just want to cherish this moment of all the women sitting here at the table on both sides. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You should have had her come in while we were
So as I pointed out, we have, thank you to the third panel, we have colleagues coming in and out. We have full testimony in front of us, and they will be joining us back again shortly. I figured out a way to kind of get us back on time, and that is not to do the double introductions. So, Ms. White, I'm going to let you lead it off and give us the full background of who you're supporting and go right into your testimony. And we will we'll start the timer when you go into your testimony, not for introducing yourself. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Chairwoman McCollum. My name is Casey White, and I'm pleased to testify today in support of the U.S. Geological Survey on behalf of the Geological Society of America. GSA is a scientific society with more than 20,000 members from academia, industry, and government in more than 100 countries. GSA applauds the work of this subcommittee to increase the USGS budget in fiscal year 2020. Thank you for supporting the survey and ensuring its ability to continue to serve the nation through its research and partnerships. GSA urges Congress to build on these investments and provide USGS with $1.35 billion in fiscal year 2021. This increase will allow the USGS to implement new initiatives created by recent legislation, sustain base funding for critical research and monitoring, and update and maintain its facilities. The USGS is one of the nation's premier science agencies with a distinctive capacity to engage interdisciplinary teams of experts to gather data, conduct research, and develop integrated decision support tools about our Earth. In addition to underpinning the science activities and decisions of the Department of the Interior, USGS research is used by communities and businesses across the nation to make informed decisions regarding land use planning, emergency response, natural resource management, engineering, and education. The recent enactment of several pieces of legislation illustrates the bipartisan congressional support for the agency. Last year, the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation Management and Recreation Act established a national volcano early warning and monitoring system at the USGS, and we authorized the USGS's National Cooperative Geologic Mapping Program. The previous year, the enactment of the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program Reauthorization Act of 2018 reauthorized and expanded this important program, including adding earthquake early warning capabilities. GSA recommends adequate funding to implement these laws. USGS research addresses many of society's greatest challenges. For example, natural hazards are a major cause of fatalities and economic losses. NOAA found that in 2019, the United States saw 14 weather and climate events with losses exceeding $1 billion each, which included floods, severe storms, tropical cyclones, and wildfires. USGS data is utilized by decision makers in many sectors to mitigate the effects of these natural disasters. For example, the aviation sector relies upon USGS volcano monitoring to create safe flight routes. NOAA depends on data from the USGS to issue flood, drought, and tsunami warnings. USGS is a key partner in obtaining measurements necessary to predict severe space weather events, which can have drastic impacts on the electric power grid, satellite communications, and navigation systems, as highlighted in the March 2019 executive order coordinating national resilience to electromagnetic pulses. GSA urges investment in USGS hazards programs, as an improved scientific understanding of these events will reduce future losses by informing effective planning and mitigation. In addition to conducting research on long-term patterns of climate change, USGS connects science to local communities. Climate adaptation science centers provide scientific information necessary to anticipate, monitor, and adapt to the effects of climate change at regional and local levels. These centers work with communities to make smart, cost-effective decisions on issues as diverse as protecting cultural resources to planning for wildfires. GSA appreciates the expansion of this important program in fiscal year 2020. As the U.S. increases its use of renewable energy, there's a vital need to understand the abundance and distribution of critical mineral resources, both within the U.S. and globally. This goal will require expanded collection and analysis of geological, geochemical, and geophysical data. Earth MRI is an important part of this effort, and GSA appreciates congressional support for this program. The Landsat satellite program has amassed the largest archive of remotely sensed data in the world, a tremendously important resource for everything from natural resource planning, land use planning, and assessing water resources, the impacts of natural disasters, and global agriculture. GSA supports interagency efforts to ensure the continuation of this vital monitoring program. All of these endeavors are supported by the core system sciences, facilities, and science support. These programs and services, such as geologic mapping and data preservation, provide critical information and infrastructure that form the foundation of USGS research. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today for the support of the U.S. Geological Survey. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Make sure the mic's on.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is John Palatiello, and I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the 3DEP Coalition. I'm also the Government Affairs Consultant to the National Society of Professional Surveyors and the founder and president of USGeo, an informal coalition of leading geospatial firms. The 3DEP Coalition includes more than 40 organizations. If I may, I'd like to insert into the record a list of these organizations that support the 3DEP program.
We'll do that. Just make sure that you leave that at the end of the
I will do.
presentation.
Thank you very much. As the subcommittee is aware, 3DEP is the USGS program that is satisfying the growing demand for consistent, high-quality topographic data across the country, primarily through the collection of elevation data with LiDAR. There are more than 600 applications that benefit from this data. They support economic growth, responsible environmental protection, resource development, infrastructure improvement, and many more. USGS's own assessment of this program shows that it generates about $13 billion in annual benefits and has a benefit cost ratio of 4.7 to 1. So it's an extraordinary investment of our tax dollars. And I would say that it provides the underpinning to a number of the programs that you will hear about in the course of the public witnesses here today. Since 2015, over 200 federal, state, local, and non-governmental partners have collaborated in support of 3DEP. I have a map here that my colleague is showing that we're now about 67% of the nation is completed with this data for the first time over. The optimal funding for this program is at $146 million a year. At that level, the country can be mapped in 7 years and then go on another repeat cycle. So we, at our current funding level, we're at about 67%. I'd like to draw your attention to two things with regard to this map. One, Madam Chair, I think jumps out at you is that there is unfortunately a big white space in the middle of the country, other than perhaps the Twin Cities. And so there is a tremendous need for precision agriculture, for stormwater management, for a variety of applications in agricultural America. The other point that I think is very important to draw attention to is the fact that the other major unmapped part of the country is the public lands west. And there is a critical need, whether you're talking about wildfire mapping, rural broadband development, rural infrastructure. We would hope that the subcommittee could fund this program not only through USGS, but through the other agencies that are the landowners, Forest Service, BLM, that have an inherent interest in having this data for good management. As I mentioned in the beginning of my statement, 3DEP has supported numerous programs, applications, and activities. I would hasten to add, Mr. Joyce, that in my written statement, I talk about some great work that an Ohio firm is doing on the 3DEP program, and that is being replicated by the other firms that are involved as well. But when we talk about hazard mitigation, energy resource development, wildlife and habitat management, floodplain mapping, flood risk management, agriculture, precision farming, natural resource conservation, invasive species mapping and mitigation, infrastructure, transportation, climate change monitoring, all of these are activities where the 3DEP data becomes good baseline data for all of them. So we would urge the full funding of the program at its optimum level of $146 million. We understand the constraints on you, whether we do this solely within USGS or through the other agencies, as I mentioned. There's a critical need to finish the country and provide that data and the benefits that I mentioned. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you this morning.
Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, Mr. Simpson, Vice Chair Pingree, Mrs. Watson-Coleman. I'm David Jonas Bardeen. I appreciate your again holding this public hearing, and again letting me testify. This subcommittee was the leader on the USGS geomagnetism program that had such success in the minibus that was signed into law on December 20th. And I want to give you all the credit in the world. You identified issues, all right? You identified the issue of what happens when the Air Force withdraws its stipend. You dug into the facts. Your staff went and found out with the Air Force on the one hand, but also with USGS stuff, which they don't tell you in the way the Green Book, the budget justifications are done nowadays. So you have to dig them out on why 3 observatories might have been closed down, which really had to do with deferred maintenance issues that I want to raise. And you fully funded the administration's request for the $1.7 million for 1 more year's worth of the magnetotelluric survey in order to try to do what the president's executive order of March of last year calls for, completion in 4 years. So I give you credit, I give you hosanna, and I hope, Madam Chair, that you and your staff, again, will dig in on some of the issues I want to raise. Today, I just want to talk thematically. I'm not asking you. You raised the appropriation for the USGS geomagnetism program, Congress did, to $4 million, which is almost all of the $4.1 million that the House voted for. Your Senate colleagues came around to your advice and your insights, which I give them credit, but I give you the most credit and thanks. The $4 million that the minibus appropriates is almost the entire $4.1 million that the House did. The Senate would have had a somewhat lower number. And one of the differences was on the magnetotelluric survey, that you fully funded the administration's request. They initially didn't, but then finally in the minibus they did. There are a couple of things I'd like you to look into. And as I say, this is thematic testimony. After we see the administration's actual proposal next week, I probably will supplement it. At the very least, I'll give you a table which shows you year by year what has been requested and what has been appropriated. And I can't fill in the bottom line now because I don't know it yet. But basically, the history has been flat, flat, flat until the sequester, and then down. And only last year, thanks to this subcommittee and the minibus, did it go up to the $4 million. I think it should be higher. I'd like you to look into at least 2 questions. One is the $1.7 million for the magnetotelluric survey. This is a new undertaking for USGS and the geomagnetism program. They've never done it before. They are working hard to figure out how to do the details. And I hope that you, on a tactful staff level, will follow what are the issues. At the moment, none of that money's been obligated. Now, it's not remarkable since it was appropriated on December 20th and none of it's been obligated. But we're not going to feel good about it if that isn't corrected, cured by the end of the fiscal year. And I think it's a question of finding what are the roadblocks, if any, and what needs to be done there. The second area I would like you to take a look into is deferred maintenance. There's a problem for some of the observatories on deferred maintenance. The formula, which works very well for much of the Interior Department, doesn't really apply very much to geomagnetic observatories. They're not catering to visitors like national parks. They don't have large numbers of staff people. So to the extent that priorities are set based on health and safety of staff, health and safety of visitors, they really don't apply to a facility wherever it's located. And I think we need some reconsideration. Perhaps that the administration will come up with something on its own. But if not, perhaps either in report language or even more, once you get at the facts, that would be helpful. The geomagnetism program staff does an excellent job of keeping track of the deferred maintenance issues, the accumulating balance. They have the facts. So if you ask them the questions, they can produce the answers, and I trust they will produce truthful answers. But they're not being volunteered because that's not the way it's normally run. The final area, oh, I'm supposed to stop now, so I'll stop.
Thank you. We mentioned with the other panel, you know, their succinct way in which they outlined how we needed to have more funding. And I appreciate the way this panel, and you, sir, in particular, Mr. Barton, pointed out that the House had money in for some of the projects that we're talking about today. But when Mr. Joyce and I went to conference with the Senate, when we left conference, we had $1.3 billion less than what we left the House with. So it's a challenge, and that's why these hearings today are so important, to hear your priorities, to give us some questions to be asking the administration, discussions for us to have amongst ourselves, so that with the dollars that we have, we put forth the most robust budget that meets the needs of the people here. I just want to take an observation, because we're talking about Earth, and in the testimony about Earth science, in the studying of Earth science, most high schools don't even have an Earth science class anymore. They might have a climate studies class in which they're talking about climate trends, but that's different and needs to be incorporated into a more robust Earth science class. So I was the only girl in my Earth science class, and it is something that I have found very useful for me, just as taking a biology class or other things like that, because it's the planet we live on. So thank you. As a social studies teacher, I want to thank you for shouting out for Earth science, because that's where social science and physical science meet each other in things. So thank you for pointing that out, and I'm going to talk to my education colleagues and do some lobbying. Terrific. So, Mr. Joyce, thank you for joining us. And I didn't have a question. I had a comment, and so I'll turn it over to you and see if there's anything a question or comment you have.
None at this time, but thank you very much for the recognition, and thank you, Mr. Simpson, for helping me out here.
I'm great.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick one?
Yes, Ms. Pingree.
Sorry. I'll go home and do a little homework. Thank you all for the important work you do. It's obviously under-recognized most of the time. But I'll do a little homework, but will you just tell me what 3DEP means?
It's a three-dimension elevation program.
Oh, okay,
It is the topographic mapping of the country. It is primarily collected through LiDAR, which is a process where a sensor is mounted in the fuselage of an airplane. As it goes along a flight path, it is sending thousands of lasers to the ground and measuring the time it takes from that laser to leave the airplane, hit the ground, and come back and register with the sensor. And by doing thousands of pulses a second, it goes along, and all of a sudden the mountains rise and the valleys fall. And that's how modern topographic mapping is done. So this is a program to do current topographic mapping of the entire nation.
So what's the what's the range of an airplane? Like how many is it?
The size of the swath?
Yeah.
That depends on the altitude of the aircraft, and that will relate to what the scale and resolution of the mapping is that is desired. So the lower it is, the broader the swath and the higher resolution the data is. The higher the altitude is, the more narrow the swath and the less accurate or larger scale the mapping will be. So what this program does is it did create sort of a common denominator for the accuracy. All the stakeholders were brought together, a study was done, and looked at both what was a reasonable budget and what was a scale of mapping that would meet the greatest number of needs, and that is the standard in 3DEP.
So last question. So the topographic maps that we currently have, Is this sort of the next, are you doing, we have them, but you're doing like the next sort of digital, electronic?
Yeah, so you remember the pink and green topographic maps with the contours. This is the next generation. This is the replacement to that, which produces the benefit of being both digital data, so it can be used,
Yep.
applied, and manipulated, and also can be printed.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Add on, because I think one of the things that you can do on 3-depth that we can't do with some of the better precision satellites that we have where we can move in position faster is now we have a full complement. And I think this is very exciting, that if we need to look at something, what's happening with the floodplain in a large swath area, we're getting better satellite image to do that. But you can do something that they can't do, and that is, and I know the reason why Minnesota's not mapped is because of our trees, but the reason why they're not mapped is because of our trees, because the satellites can't do what you can do, and if you'd explain a little more about what LiDAR can do that the satellites can't do, and this is why they complement each other, and it's so exciting. My trees don't get in the way. That's not why I'm not mapped, but
Well, there are a lot of trees in Maine as well, and you can see Maine is a little farther along. So what
all
LiDAR...
right, guys, I have the gavel. Minnesota wins.
What LiDAR does is the technology enables the collection of what I described before about the timing and the distance from the sensor to the ground and back. You can do that to the treetop, or you can do it to the bare earth. And that way you can penetrate those tree canopies. When we used to do mapping with old conventional aerial photography, in Maine, for example, and Minnesota, particularly the northern tier states in the country, particularly where you had deciduous trees, you could only fly aerial photography or mapping during a time of the year where there's no snow. Think about this in Maine, no snow on the ground. The sun is high enough where you don't have long shadows. You can only do it around noon time, a couple of hours midday, and no leaves on the tree. Well, what's that? That's 3 days in March in Maine? I mean, in all seriousness, that was the challenge with conventional aerial photography and photogrammetry. You no longer have those constraints with LiDAR. The other benefit of LiDAR is because you can measure that tree canopy, this is an extraordinary tool in measuring, monitoring, verifying, and validate the effects of climate change. You can measure the biomass. And if we had a program where we were doing the country every year, we can go back year by year and saying, well, we're losing 3% of our biomass in the country. We don't have that data now, so we can't define the effects or measure the effects as precisely as we would like, but the technology is there.
So we have two tools in the toolbox. When we can combine them now, we can get amazing in-depth and real-time imagery. So it just means we have to be more creative on how we finance both of these types of mapping to go forward, because they're both critically important. Mr. Simpson?
I don't have any questions. What I've learned here just in the last few minutes is that we need to have a lot more forestry programs in Minnesota. Thank you.
Thank you.
Morning, Mr. Stewart. Did you have a question for the panel? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, I think there's somebody at the table who's celebrating today, if I'm not mistaken. Really? There might be maybe a birthday, or like fine wine. You just keep getting better every year.
I respect you so much, Bonnie. I will not lead Happy Birthday in a song. It would drive all our witnesses who are ready to approach the table out of the room. I was asked to sing softly many times in grade school. So Ranking Member Joyce, what we've been doing to stay on time is we've been having the panels introduce themselves
That's great.
and not counting their introduction time against their testimony time. And we found that as you come down in the panel list, right, you don't want to be the one that's running 15 minutes, now it's 20, now it's a half an hour behind. So I want to thank the panels for doing that. I will probably be leaving during this panel. So after the introductions, Mr. Joyce, Ms. Pingree will be taking the gavel.
I'm used to ladies being in charge on this committee. So.
Thank you. So please start.
Chairwoman McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, members of the subcommittee. My name is Mary Ellen Sprinkle, and I'm the president and CEO of the Core Network. On behalf of the Core Network, our 131 member cores and the 25,000 diverse core members they annually engage, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee about utilizing service and conservation cores to complete priority projects for the National Park Service and related public land management agencies. Based on the model and philosophy of the Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s, today's cores are locally based nonprofit organizations that engage young people between the ages of 16 and 30 and recently returned veterans up to age 35 in service projects that address conservation, recreation, disaster response, and community needs. Through a term of service that could last several months to a year, core participants or core members gain work experience and develop in-demand skills. Core members are compensated with a stipend or living allowance and often receive an education award or scholarship upon completing their term of service. Additionally, cores provide participants with educational programming, mentoring, access to career and personal counseling, and supportive services. Like the Civilian Conservation Corps, today's cores work with the land management agencies to maintain and improve our natural resources and recreation infrastructure. Last year alone, cores built, improved, or maintained more than 13,000 miles of multi-use trail and waterways, restored 1.4 million acres of wildlife and fish habitat, cleared almost 67,000 acres of invasive species, removed 19,000 acres of hazardous fuel, increased access to and utilization of nearly 8,000 recreational facilities, responded to 223 wildfires and other natural disasters, preserved 336 historic structures, and planted almost 1.1 million trees. Further, they leveraged an additional 107,000 volunteers who completed 537,000 service hours, valuing more than $13 million. In addition to traditional natural resource work, many cores participate in projects to preserve America's historic and cultural resources. 6 years ago, the Core Network partnered with the Historic Trust for Historic Preservation to develop the Hope Crew model. And under this model, traditional core crews work side by side with a historic preservation expert to refurbish and maintain historic structures and facilities. Several hundred projects have been completed in the years since. Through these projects, core members not only develop a sense of connection to our country's history, but learn marketable job skills. Regardless of the type of project, land managers find cores to be cost-effective and capable of producing high-quality work. The National Park Service commissioned an independent study by Booz Allen Hamilton, which found that cores can save up to 87% on certain maintenance projects. In addition, in regular surveys, virtually all federal partners report being highly satisfied with the project work and say they would work with a core again. With over $19 billion in deferred maintenance on federal lands, we need to harness America's growing enthusiasm for the great outdoors and engage more people in service and volunteerism on public lands. One obvious strategy is to engage and bring to scale the existing network of cores to start tackling a variety of deferred maintenance projects already identified by the Restore Our Parks project, which you'll hear more about in a moment. The National Park Service relies on several funding streams to engage cores in this work. Therefore, we respectfully request that you support funding increases that directly address deferred maintenance needs within the national park system. Specifically, we request strong funding levels for the repair and rehabilitation, cyclic maintenance, and line item construction accounts. In addition, we also request robust funding for similar accounts of other land management agencies under your jurisdiction, including the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Corps have long been cost-effective partners of federal land management agencies and have been working to generate excitement and new ways to engage youth and veterans in outdoor service while helping to accomplish much-needed project work. The time has come to seriously consider Corps as an essential part of any plan to tackle deferred maintenance and usher in future stewards and champions of our natural treasures. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Brengel?
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Kristen Brengel. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Parks Conservation Association. I want to thank Ranking Member Joyce and members of the subcommittee for giving us the opportunity to testify today. We're grateful for the work that all of you do on behalf of the national parks. In fact, this committee is full of park champions that we're thrilled about. Ranking Member Joyce, I want to thank you in particular for your work on the Great Lakes, pollution, invasive species, all of the issues up there. It's been great working with you and your staff. We truly appreciate all the subcommittee does for parks given scarce funding. As the chair pointed out earlier, the overall budget is tough to work with. In particular, we want to thank you for the land and water conservation funding last year. It was particularly impressive. So I'm here to share some concerns that we have about the current state of our national parks and our worries about the staff who protect them. We're hearing and seeing the following. Morale is low. This is due to weakening policies, the looming reorganization, and the lack of leadership. In fact, as some of you may know, 10 of the 16 senior Park Service positions that oversee critical departments, including operations, interpretation, visitor and resource protection, and even the acting National Park Service Director are either vacant or without a permanent leader. Second, many parks are suffering from unrepaired damage, as my colleague pointed out to the right, and the effects of climate change. The other issue, and Ms. Pingree, you know this very well, some of our popular parks are completely overcrowded, including Acadia, which I was just there. Beautiful. And this can lead to resource harm. The other issue is conservation is taking a backseat to development outside of their borders. This is due to rampant drilling and mining. Proposals which this committee is very well aware of, and specifically we thank you for Chaco, for the language on Chaco cultural. In the last 3 years, NPCA has documented 112 administrative actions that erode protections for waterways, wildlife, visitor experiences, air quality, and quality of life for staff. The consequences of these actions could be felt for generations. We appreciate the committee's willingness to consider some of these issues as you deliberate the bill. To dive specifically into the National Park Service budget, park operations and deferred maintenance are our highest funding priorities. One of the largest challenges facing park superintendents is operating budgets insufficient to prevent the reduction of personnel. One superintendent recently reported uncontrollable fixed costs of more than 5%. This will no doubt result in fewer staff. One area where the staff shortage becomes a major issue is with the huge influx of visitors to many popular parks. With inadequate staff, national parks are getting crushed. Joshua Tree, for example, no longer has an off-season. There's just tons of people there through the year. In 2018, there were 1.6 million more visitors than a decade prior, similar to Zion and other parks in Utah. That 125% increase in visitation was coupled by a 31% erosion of base staffing levels. As an example, a Joshua Tree ranger was making sure cars weren't parking on the side of the road, crushing vegetation. When asked the ranger what his job actually was, he said he was on the trail crew. Because he was dealing with so many visitors, he couldn't work on the trail. This means less maintenance. The lack of operations funding has a ripple effect. Now getting to the deferred maintenance backlog, it's one of our highest priorities, and my colleague at Pew next to me is going to testify in greater detail on this important issue. But one example to point out is Great Sand Dunes. Some of the pressing projects are very connected to visitors. The visitor center roof, re-roofing of the comfort stations, and rehabilitation of campgrounds. These are just some of the thousands of examples that there are across the park system. We're working on other funding sources, including the bill that Mr. Kilmer is leading, the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act. We're thankful for that bill, and we appreciate all the co-sponsors here. We hope that it gets signed into law this year, but we still need this committee to focus on deferred maintenance and routine maintenance as we look at the budget. I should note a huge thanks for the Centennial Challenge funding, which also helps with the maintenance backlog and great programs. National Heritage Area funding, which is also a wonderful program. Endangered Species Act funding, and of course the EPA's geographic programs in last year's bill. As I mentioned earlier, we are alarmed by the impacts of climate change. We must ensure the Park Service has the resources and guidance they need to monitor climate change impacts to the parks and utilize the best available science to help parks adapt to climate change. We can reduce repair costs if parks have the funds they need to be resilient from the start. On another topic, we appreciate your oversight on the Interior Department's reorganization. We're concerned not just about the BLM move, but the potential for a larger initiative to harm management and stewardship of our parks. We don't want the reorganization to undermine the Park Service's conservation-driven work or the morale of park staff. We commend the oversight and the report language on this. We're also happy that you were able to secure statutory reprogramming language, which ensures greater oversight of the administration and reaffirms the role and powers of the appropriators. This time last year, our parks were recovering from a shutdown, made worse by the administration's use of fees to keep parks open to harm. So we're grateful for your work on the issue and hope we can identify more opportunities for your engagement. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Rebecca, tell me how to say your last name. Kanufki.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So good morning, Ranking Member Joyce and members of the subcommittee. I am Rebecca Kanufki, officer at the Pew Charitable Trust Restore America's Parks campaign, and thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Pew Charitable Trust applies a rigorous analytical approach to improve public policy, inform the public, and invigorate civic life. The Restore America's Parks campaign seeks to conserve the natural and cultural assets of the national park system by providing common sense, long-term solutions to its multi-billion-dollar repair backlog. The National Park Service is responsible for managing and maintaining more than 400 nationally significant sites in all 50 states and several territories. These park units document the remarkable people, heritage, and the places that comprise the ongoing story of America. Unfortunately, our 100-plus-year-old National Park Service has aging infrastructure that is deteriorating. Compounding this challenge are visitation pressures on park resources. National Park Service recorded over 318 million visits in 2018 and years of inadequate funding for maintenance needs. The Park Service is not able to keep up with the pace of repairs for assets that include over 5,000 miles of paved roads, nearly 1,500 bridges, 18,000 miles of trails, more than 28,000 buildings, including historic structures, employee housing, over 2,000 sewage systems and other facilities such as battlefields, campgrounds, interpretive facilities, and monuments and memorials. As a result, the agency must triage repair needs, and it has a backlog of deferred maintenance that's estimated at $11.9 billion based on 2018 data. Drawing down a maintenance backlog that has accrued over decades requires a combined approach, one that includes robust annual appropriations funding, dedicated funding, and policy reforms to leverage technology and increase efficiencies. Adequate discretionary investment is essential for NPS to keep up with the maintenance needs, over 3/4 of which are priority projects. Pew commends the subcommittee for providing increases for NPS deferred maintenance in recent years, and we respectfully urge you to build on this support in FY 2021, as there still is a substantial gap between NPS discretionary funding and what the agency needs to address its priority projects repairs. Specifically within the operation of the National Park System and construction appropriations, Pew urges the subcommittee to maximize allocations for repair and rehab, cyclic maintenance, and line item construction accounts. These accounts provide the bulk of the necessary funding for the Park Service to undertake maintenance that will keep our national parks accessible to the public and safe. Funding for planning and adequate staff capacity, as Kristen mentioned, are also critical to the execution of repair and maintenance needs, and we ask that these accounts be funded as robustly as possible. Further, we urge the allocation of $4 million for employee housing to help expedite correcting the dilapidated state of ranger housing. According to NPS, deferred maintenance for employee housing totaled more than $186 million in fiscal year 2018, yet the agency received only $2.2 million that year for housing improvement program. Another important program that my colleagues have also mentioned, the Centennial Challenge program, which matches federal dollars with private donations and directs the monies towards priority deferred maintenance projects and other park programs. This has the potential to leverage even more funding, and by raising the annual appropriations from $20 million to $30 million, federal dollars could encourage more partner and private donations, facilitating the repair of even more park infrastructure. Dedicated funding is an also important way to draw down the backlog, and the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act, and thanks again to Representative Kilmer for his leadership on this bill, and also Congressman Bishop here in the House, and the companion Restore Our Parks Act, sponsored by Senators Portman, Warner, Alexander, and King, in the Senate would direct over $6 billion of federal agency energy development revenue to tackle park repairs over a 5-year period. This dedicated funding source would provide consistent, reliable funding to enable MPS to better plan for complicated, large-scale project repairs. If enacted, this bipartisan, widely supported legislation, endorsed by over 3/4 of the House, a half of the Senate, the administration, and 82% of the American public, would provide NPS the resources to help tackle its highest priority repairs. The intent of the legislation is not to supplant annual appropriations, however, which are needed to ensure that NPS can do current maintenance work needed to prevent the repairs from escalating and becoming more expensive over time. In conclusion, fixing our parks has overwhelming support from Congress and the American public. To be successful, NPS needs robust annual appropriations and dedicated funding, and we appreciate the discretionary increases in park maintenance accounts over the past several years and encourage the subcommittee to continue to build on that investment. Thank you for your consideration of Pew's requests and for your continued support of our national parks. And Chairwoman McCollum, I'll just add that it comes to me through my family. My stepmother was a Park Service superintendent at Voyageurs National Park in your beautiful state. So thank you again.
Okay. Chair McCollum, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate this opportunity to present the National Trust testimony. My name is Tom Cassidy. I'm the Vice President of Government Relations. The National Trust is a privately funded nonprofit chartered by Congress in 1949. We work to save America's historic places to enrich our future. And this is a line I've been practicing, and it's the best line I've ever delivered in this room. Thank you for creating and enacting last year's bill. It was the most preservation-friendly appropriations bill in the history of the Republic, both for its historic funding levels and also for policy directions throughout the report. Thank you. We are confident that the subcommittee will continue its robust support for funding for programs within your jurisdiction. My written testimony includes recommendations on a variety of reports, as did our best-selling report from last year, now in production for this year. Let's start with the third successive year of record funding for the Historic Preservation Fund. Last year's level of $118.6 million represents a 46% increase from FY17 levels. HPF funding supports fundamental preservation activities provided by state and tribal preservation officers, including survey, nomination of properties to the National Register, and project reviews required for historic tax credit projects. Among many highlights within the competitive grants programs, we would like to emphasize the committee's $15.5 million appropriation for the successful African American Civil Rights Program and the new $2.5 million program to preserve and highlight sites and stories associated with securing civil rights for all Americans, including women, American Latino, Native American, and LGBTQ Americans. This subcommittee made that happen. Thank you. And this really promises to be a lasting legacy to recognize the sites and stories that tell our fullest and most inclusive history. And of course, our national stories also benefit from your strong commitment to increased funding for Save America's Treasures. In terms of the National Park Service and the operation of the park system, a small but important increase last year within resource stewardship was $1 million for the African American Civil Rights Reconstruction Era and other networks. We urge an increase for these programs this year, including language that would make some of these funds available for grants to network sites. We've had a lot of discussion about NPS deferred maintenance, so I'll try to shorten this area, but this committee has been a champion of tackling this program. And of the $12 billion DM backlog, 47% of that is attributed to historic assets. We have for years really focused on the repair and rehab and the cyclical maintenance programs. These are the programs that fund, marginal increases in these accounts are spread out throughout the system. They form the basis to fund core network projects and Hope Crew projects. So we would just really emphasize sustained investment in these. They're not high profile. Cyclical maintenance is not like a line item construction project, but it has broad-based impact throughout the system. And we also strongly support the creation of a reliable, dedicated funding source. Thank you, Mr. Kilmer, for your sponsorship of that, and Mr. Bishop. And everybody here is a co-sponsor, so thank you for that. In terms of the Park Service cultural programs, thank you for your attention to the agency's proposed revisions of procedures for listing projects on the National Register, and language calling for the agency to withdraw its proposed rule and consult with stakeholders. We are monitoring the situation closely, but remain concerned with the direction the service may take. I'd also like to address the Bureau of Land Management, specifically the Cultural Resources Program. Not as many people realize that BLM oversees the largest, most diverse, and scientifically important collection of historic and cultural resources on our nation's public lands. We appreciate the committee's commitment to ongoing oversight of the department's reorganization. Please sustain that oversight. The Trust and many other organizations continue to be concerned with the impact of the reorganization and loss of staff within the Cultural Resources Division. You directed funding last year of $1.5 million within the BLM Cultural Resources account for something called the National Cultural Resources Information Management System. But basically, as we learned from our USGS friends earlier, if you don't map it, you can't save it. And this program is an innovative partnership between BLM and state historic preservation officers to support predictive modeling and data analysis to enhance planning for large cross-jurisdictional projects. It's a significant and too often overlooked preservation success story, and we would recommend once again providing specific funding for that above enacted. And my time is over, so thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation and your thoughtful words, and thank you to everybody here. Of course, we greatly appreciate the work that all of you do, and it's so vitally important in states like mine, but everywhere across the country. Mr. Kilmer, do you have any questions or thoughts?
I had a couple.
Go for it. Yeah.
First, for the core network, it's not a question. I just want to take a moment to say thank you for the amazing work you do. Oh, sorry. Am I supposed to? Can I borrow your mic?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thanks for the amazing work you do. In our neck of the woods, Jay Satz from the Northwest Youth Corps does outstanding work, innovative work. We're really lucky to have him, and it's really, I think, a great example of the work that happens in our local communities by the core network. So I could make it a question by just saying, don't you agree? But so let the record show she said yes. I do also want to express gratitude for your references to the maintenance backlog within our park system. This subcommittee and our chair, I think, has worked very hard to ensure that the agency has sufficient funding, but we know that there's an $11 billion with a B maintenance backlog. And to your point, the Restore Our Parks and Public Lands Act is targeted at addressing that. NPCA, Pew have been terrific partners in this. We've got 330 co-sponsors at this point, and I think that's a testament to your organizations collectively for sort of making the case. I guess my question is, so what else should we be doing?
We need to get it to the floor as quickly as possible.
And I'll just add that there's 39 appropriators on the bill as co-sponsors on a dedicated funding bill. So that's impressive.
Yeah, I don't know if you read in the E&E newsletter this morning, Mr. McConnell also talked about bringing it to the Senate floor. So it would be really great if we could move it in both chambers this
Super.
year. So we did so much work. It's time to move it.
Let's get it done. Thank you. Thanks. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Joyce? No, Mr. Sort? Well, we greatly appreciate your support, helping to make the case for the things that I think this committee knows are really important, and I feel confident Mr. Kilmer will get the bill to the floor shortly with his great power and wisdom. Yeah. Thank you, and thanks so much for the work that all of you do.
Thank you.
The next panel, come up. Yeah, that's what everybody talks about. You guys need.
I'm guessing.
Great, you guys you're so quick and efficient, getting right up there. So we're excited to have our next panel. Let's go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Colton.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Sorry about that. Thanks for having me. My name's Adam Colton. I'm the Executive Director of Alaska Wilderness League, which is the only national organization devoted exclusively to the protection of Alaska's national treasures, for which the Interior Department plays such a critical role in stewarding for the benefit of all Americans. Here because there are two of our national treasures in Alaska that are at grave risk, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and the Tongass National Forest. As we speak, the administration is rushing to hold the first ever oil and gas lease sale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And in the process, we believe it's sidestepping environmental laws, sidelining scientists, skipping required consultation with indigenous people. This process jeopardizes the very values for which President Eisenhower originally set aside this area, endangering not only iconic wildlife such as threatened polar bears, but the way of life of the Gwich'in people and their 15 villages. Beyond that, and perhaps most notable for members of this subcommittee, the Interior Department has also completely abandoned its commitment and the legislative requirement of the 2017 Tax Act that Arctic Refuge lease sales generate $2.2 billion in revenue, half of which for the federal treasury. Now, thanks to this subcommittee and the good work of the chair, last year's bill attempted to direct the Bureau of Land Management to set minimum lease sale bids to meet the required revenues of the Tax Act. And it was retained on the House floor in a strong bipartisan fashion. But unfortunately, it wasn't included in the final bill. And as a result, the BLM could, in the coming months, hold a lease sale that auctions off this cherished landscape at fire sale prices, setting up a future scenario in which Congress will need to appropriate even more money to buy back leases from oil companies that will bid low and attempt to sell back high. Last year, in response to this subcommittee's actions, we heard drilling proponents argue against any requirement to meet the promised revenue targets. This begs the question, were the highly touted revenue and oil bonanza production simply a ruse to catch a ride on the budget reconciliation train? Why are some now so fearful and opposed to language that simply enforces what Congress already passed? Might they be worried that major banks like Goldman Sachs are unwilling to finance Arctic refuge oil and gas development? Alaska's Senior Center acknowledged that the goal here is simply to get leases out in the hands of oil companies because then, quote, it's tougher to throw roadblocks in place. The administration's intent here is clear. Get leases sold no matter the cost, or in this case, whatever the taxpayer ripoff may be. Considering this, it's not surprising that the administration is barreling toward a lease sale in ways that not only disregard the fiscal consequences, but also the impact to the resources on the ground. Take the issue of polar bears. Climate change and disappearing sea ice is causing bears to come onshore more frequently in search of food and to build their winter maternity dens. Yet the Interior Department has developed no meaningful restrictions on seismic exploration to prevent the killing of polar bears. If all that weren't troubling enough, Politico has reported the administration has silenced scientists and pressured others in pursuit of advancing leasing as quickly as possible. Given the reckless manner in which the Interior Department is seeking to hand over this national treasure to oil companies and its disregard for the requirements of the Tax Act, including its own revenue assumptions, we ask you to again include language in the underlying bill that forces the administration to meet its promises and its legal responsibilities. We similarly ask the subcommittee's help to rein in the administration as it seeks to exempt the entire 17 million acre Tongass National Forest from roadless protections. You know, we heard the president talk about planting 1 trillion trees. These are 800-year-old trees. This is America's rainforest, and there are enormous subsidies that are still intact for the Tongass. It makes no sense to, on the one hand, talk about planting trees to sequester carbon, and the other, subsidize the destruction of our most iconic, cherished American rainforest. The Alaska Wilderness League strongly supported Representative Blumenauer's amendment, successful amendment to last year's bill to end taxpayer subsidies for road building activity in the Tongass. And, you know, even now the Forest Service timber program is costing taxpayers about $30 million per year for a loss of approximately $600 million over the last 20 years. We urge you to include the Blumenauer language, which passed the House with a bipartisan 243 to 188 vote in this year's underlying bill. Doing so would protect U.S. taxpayers, Southeast Alaska's vibrant outdoor economy, hunting, fishing, outdoor recreation interests, as well as wildlife and our climate. Thank you for the opportunity to testify and share our views.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stratton.
Thank you, Congressman Pingree and Ranking Member Joyce and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tim Stratton, and I'm a policy analyst at the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. POGO is a nonpartisan, independent watchdog that investigates and exposes waste, corruption, abuse of power, and when the government fails to serve the public. For decades, POGO has shed the light on the need for the federal government to ensure oil and natural gas industries are paying their fair share for the publicly owned onshore and offshore resources they extract and profit from. POGO has recommendations to provide more accountability and transparency for oil and gas royalty policy at the Department's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. We urge the subcommittee to prohibit the use of funds to approve leases where the Bureau retroactively lowered its valuations without public notice and requires that no public funds be spent on approving delayed value leases that were not evaluated by a neutral third party. The Bureau administers offshore drilling rights and periodically holds auctions in which bidders obtain leases for the underlying oil and gas deposits under specific tracts of land. These resources are owned by the taxpayer, so the Bureau is legally required to ensure that taxpayers receive fair market value, in part by collecting royalties on the sale for oil and gas produced from these lands. But the Bureau's royalty relief procedures often leave tens of billions of dollars in the pockets of the extractive industry rather than being returned to taxpayers. In a recent report, the Government Accountability Office identified 2 additional procedures the Interior Department has engaged in for decades that may not have resulted in a full fair market return. The GAO's analysis closely tracks with the findings of POGO's 2018 report, Drilling Down Big Oil's Bidding. And the nonpartisan organization Taxpayers for Common Sense has reported similar problems at the Department's Bureau of Land Management through its increased use of awarding of non-competitive leases. The Bureau sets royalty rates for offshore oil and gas and can reduce or waive royalty payments in an attempt to increase production. But as the Bureau itself has found, the practice often means taxpayers lose out on the fair return they're owed. The GAO found that leases that had been awarded between 1996 and 2000 resulted in about $18 billion, that's billion with a B, in foregone royalties through 2018. When it auctions off tracts of land, the Bureau is supposed to reject bids that are below the estimated value of the land. Instead, however, the GAO found that when a bid comes in lower than the Bureau's own valuation, the Bureau often retroactively lowers its initial value and then accepts the bid. The GAO estimated that between March 2000 and June 2018, the Bureau could have collected $567 million in additional auction revenue if it had not engaged this practice so consistently. The Bureau does not disclose when it awards drilling rights based on reduced valuations, and because of this, the practice of lowering valuations has resulted in the loss of hundreds of millions of dollars in public revenue. This committee has a vested interest in ensuring that the Bureau is held accountable. To provide that accountability, we urge the subcommittee to prohibit the use of funds to approve leases when the Bureau retroactively lowers its valuations without public notice. The GAO's report also highlighted problems with how the Bureau considers the present value and the delayed value of a tract of seafloor, which may have resulted again in $873 million in foregone revenue from March 2000 to June 2018. Again, that's money that should have gone to the American taxpayer. If a bid is lower than the present value but higher than the delayed value, the Bureau can accept it. But the Bureau has been projecting delayed values to be lower than they should be, allowing it to accept lower bids. The GAO found that Bureau's unreasonably large forecasts of depreciation have increasingly been the deciding factor in accepting lower bids, and as a result, the government is unnecessarily passing up hundreds of millions of dollars in potential revenue. GAO recommended that an independent third party should examine whether the Interior Department's use of delayed values deliver fair market value and whether it should stop using these lower valuations. POGO believes such an independent examination would bring about greater accountability to the bid valuation process. We recommend that this subcommittee require no funds be spent on approving its delayed value lease that were not evaluated by a third party. Again, POGO has prepared recommendations to provide more accountability and transparency for oil and gas royalty policy at the Bureau, which we'd be happy to provide to the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity again to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Messmer?
Good morning. Thank you, Congresswoman Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee for this opportunity. I'm Mike Messmer, an ocean advocate at Oceana, the largest international advocacy organization devoted solely to ocean conservation. I am here to speak in opposition to expanded offshore oil and gas drilling, particularly to the Trump administration's 2019-2024 five-year program for offshore oil and gas leasing that the Department of the Interior's Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is currently developing. Oceana thanks the committee and members for including provisions in the FY 2020 Interior Environment Appropriations Bill to restrict funding for offshore oil and gas leasing in the Atlantic Ocean, Pacific Ocean, and Eastern Gulf of Mexico. There is long-standing precedent for this, as Congress, for nearly 3 decades, heeded concerns from the communities it represents and restricted spending on offshore federal oil and gas leasing and drilling activities via the appropriations process. We urge the committee to include these offshore drilling moratoria again as you craft the FY 2021 base bill. We also encourage committee leaders to work with the Senate to include these provisions in any final package. The 5-year program governs when and where BOEM can offer offshore drilling leases to the oil and gas industry. In January 2018, the Trump administration released its 2019-2024 draft proposed program. As it stands, this proposal would radically expand future oil and gas leasing to the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans, as well as off Florida's Gulf Coast. The draft plan proposes opening the vast majority of the outer continental shelf. Reinstating offshore drilling moratoria through the appropriations process would prevent BOEM from leasing specific areas that Congress wishes to protect from future offshore drilling. Without moratoria provisions, Congress relinquishes its power to influence the future of offshore drilling to the executive branch. Offshore drilling threatens the continued prosperity of coastal communities and states whose economies are directly tied to clean, oil-free shores and waters. As of today, opposition and concern over offshore drilling activities has been expressed by Every East and West Coast governor, more than 380 municipalities, over 2,300 state, local, and federal elected officials, Democrats and Republicans alike, and alliances representing over 56,000 businesses and more than 500,000 fishing families. In addition to permanently altering the landscape of many towns up and down the east and west coasts, offshore drilling is a dirty investment with long-term implications for the environment and the safety of workers. Large-scale catastrophes, such as BP's Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, highlight how a single accident can cause enormous and lasting consequences. The Deepwater Horizon tragedy killed 11 rig workers, spilled more than 200 million gallons of oil, fouled thousands of miles of coastline, endangered public health, and killed thousands of birds, dolphins, and fish. Seaside communities on the Gulf are still recovering, physically and economically, from the estimated $36.9 billion in damage caused by the Deepwater Horizon spill. Offshore oil development is dirty across the board, beyond catastrophic spills that make headlines. At least 6,500 oil spills occurred in U.S. waters between 2007 and 2017. Further, are typically far larger than what is reported. During that same time period, hundreds of workers were injured every year, and on average, a fire or explosion erupted on offshore rigs every 3 days on the outer continental shelf. Offshore oil and gas exploration activities, such as high-intensity geophysical seismic surveys, pose dangers to marine life before commercial drilling even begins. Noise from these dynamite-like blasts is so loud that it can disturb, injure, or even kill animals across the entire marine ecosystem, from the smallest zooplankton to the largest whales. The North Atlantic right whale, one of the most endangered marine mammal species in the world, is a particular concern. Experts say seismic airgun blasting for oil and gas exploration may well represent a tipping point for the survival of this critically endangered whale. We urge the subcommittee and committee to restrict any funding in the FY 2021 Interior Environment Appropriations Bill for the purpose of conducting any new offshore oil and gas leasing and related activities. The threats to coastal economies, marine wildlife, and your own constituents are simply too great to risk expanding the footprint of offshore drilling. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Thank you all very much for your testimony and for the critical work that your organizations are doing. I just want to make a couple of comments, and particularly, well, to each one of you, but thank you to POGO for the work that you've done on, the report, researching this, and I think particularly in light of the last panel where, funding for land and water conservation, Kilmer bill that's proposed, so much of it depends on how much we receive on these leases. So the idea that there would be any mechanism that would reduce the amount that we receive, and also that there's no transparency is really unthinkable. So thank you for bringing that to light, and I hope we can do some work on that in the next bill. Excuse me. Certainly, we're all concerned about the administration's proposals in Alaska, and even as far away as Maine, I hear from my constituents about this all the time because I do think we think of these as national treasures. In terms of the logging rights, as you mentioned, the president just said we're going to plant 1 million trees, and we don't need to cut down trees in areas where we should be protecting them. And obviously, there's appropriate places for forestry harvesting. My state is one of them, but there are places in public lands where we shouldn't be doing that. And I'm particularly disturbed about the leasing of oil and gas opportunities, particularly when we're not paid the full value. But even more importantly, I think as solar and wind and renewable resources become even more affordable, the fact that we're not investing in that, yet we are encouraging and supporting and subsidizing oil and gas leases is ridiculous at this moment in time when we have bigger concerns to think about. I just heard someone give a talk that said 5 years ago, 1% in 1% of the world, solar and wind was more financially feasible than oil and gas. 5 years later, today, in 2/3 of the world, it is more cost-effective to invest in solar and wind. So the very idea that we're supporting that is unthinkable. It also makes a lot of those resources subprime, and so over time, I mean, the reason the value is going down is because it's increasingly less valuable. There's a reason these companies want, you know, a cheaper, no expense to their bid, is because they know in the future there's not going to be much support for it. So it's just bad policy all the way. And of course, being from an ocean state where we have so many concerns about the future of the ocean, and I think you know our entire delegation, our tripartisan delegation, and our governor, our state legislature are just furious at the idea that the administration would suggest that we should drill. It would be a huge challenge to our fishing industry. It would be a disaster to our tourism industry, two very important industries to our state, and it doesn't make any sense. And we're much more interested in investing in offshore wind and solar projects, and that's where our money should be. So obviously I didn't ask you guys any questions, but I just wanted to rant there for a minute and really support the work that you're doing, and I'm so grateful for you helping us to make that case. Mr. Joyce.
Certainly appreciate all of you coming today and the information that you've provided all of us, and I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you each for the work you do. Mr. Messmer, I last week was in Grays Harbor County, Washington, out on the coast meeting with folks who work in the fishing industry. And obviously they have, it's been a challenging time. And the concern about offshore drilling is real. You know, it is perceived in our region by Democrats, Republicans, you name it, as a real threat to those livelihoods, to our maritime industry, to commercial fishing, sport fishing, tourism. We have a $50 billion maritime economy, almost 200,000 jobs supported by it just in Washington state alone. And it is incompatible with oil and gas development. And you spoke about hoping to see in the bill restriction of funds to be used for offshore drilling. Any other direction, either to this committee or to Congress, to protect the coastal communities that are really put at risk?
Again, I think specifically, I think the focus. Oh, thank you. I think at this time what we would really like to see is the restoration of these funding restrictions to the bill. They had a 30-year. This is nothing new. They have a long-standing. They're something out of the legacy of Congress. This is something that Congress had done in response to the will of its constituents, and because of the interest of members as well, for almost 30 years, from 1982 to 2008. And so we very much think that this is restoring these provisions to the bill as you did last year. Unfortunately, we didn't make it through the Senate and on to the White House. But, you know, obviously, regardless, we keep pushing on that front, as well as protecting the North Atlantic from seismic. I know there was language that Mr. Cunningham offered last year, which was amended to the bill, and we obviously support that language as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I want to just add, I meant to say that, but thank you so much for the data and the support around limiting seismic drilling exploration. Obviously, the right whale is a huge topic in the Gulf of Maine, and we're concerned about every threat to the right whales, and so thank you for making that case. Thank you to the panel. We appreciate all your work and appreciate you being here today, and we'll look forward to our last but certainly not least panel of the morning. Okay, well, thank you for being so prompt. And we'll go ahead and begin this panel. Thank you, Ms. Kraska?
Kraska.
Kraska, yes. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Exactly how it sounds. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Good morning, Vice Chair Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the non-lethal and sustainable management of our nation's wild horses and burros under the care of the BLM. My name is Katie Kraska, and I am the Senior Manager of Federal Legislation for the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Wild horses and burros are a key segment of the equine population that the ASPCA is working hard to protect. We appreciate this subcommittee's continued commitment to non-lethal management, most recently extending these protections to herds on U.S. Forest Service lands in FY20. Recognizing the American public's overwhelming opposition to horse slaughter and killing for population control, Congress has, since the late 1980s, prohibited lethal management of our wild herds, and we urge that this continue in FY21. But wild horses and burros need more than these protections to thrive for generations to come. That is why I'm here today, to speak in support of a new humane path forward for the wild horse and burro program. If there is one thing that everyone on all sides of this highly polarized issue can agree on, it is that the status quo is not working. This program is in desperate need of a change. And though the ASPCA does not agree with the BLM's current view that the 31.6 million acres of land allotted for wild horses and burros can only support 27,000 equines, we know that achieving a sustainable program requires a stable population over time. The current strategy of moving horses off range and into holding facilities is not capable of achieving this goal because it does nothing to address population growth. We end up with more horses on range, more horses off range, and a shrinking budget to use on active management. Last year, off-range holding costs devoured 67% of the program's annual budget. Despite the negativity and polarization that has plagued this issue for decades, we want to focus on solutions. For the first time, and in large part due to this subcommittee's leadership, we have an opportunity to slowly but surely steer this program onto a sustainable and humane course. The ASPCA, along with other humane and wild horse advocacy groups, recognized that the BLM's wild horse and burro program needed not only an overhaul, but direction on how to accomplish it. Our goal was a paradigm shift, away from removals and towards on-range management achieved with proven, safe, and humane fertility control. That is why we developed a comprehensive, science-driven, non-lethal management plan that will achieve this goal within a decade. Wild horse and burro management has vexed administration after administration, Congress after Congress, which is why it is a privilege to be able to thank the Vice Chair, the Ranking Member, members of the subcommittee, and their staff for their hard work and unprecedented action in the FY20 Interior Appropriations Bill. In the end, this committee allocated an additional $21 million for a new management plan. It takes courage and expertise to recognize the need for action. This was a truly bipartisan effort, and we applaud the subcommittee's directive to BLM to ensure that effective and humane fertility control is adopted as the central pillar of its management program, and to strictly adhere to its comprehensive animal welfare program to ensure that horses and burros on and off range are always handled humanely. With the support of a wide variety of stakeholders, we are carving a humane path forward for these iconic animals, of which Americans can be proud. Assuming that the BLM meets Congress's requirements, we urge the committee to continue to increase funding for BLM's wild horse and burro program in FY21. We look forward to seeing BLM's forthcoming report, outlining how it intends to use the additional $21 million in funds, which we hope will convey their clear commitment to a humane path forward. We also support the subcommittee's commitment to oversight and understand that agency input and communication are critical to the lasting success of these efforts. From a humane and scientific standpoint, the most cost-effective way to rebalance this program is to dedicate maximum funding up front. But correct implementation, especially of fertility control, is key. Ultimately, the American public wants to see wild, free-roaming horses and burros managed with their well-being in mind. We thank the committee for taking action to achieve this, and for considering funding and programmatic needs for the wild horse and burro program in FY20. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Marienfield?
excuse me. I represent the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, a nonprofit dedicated to the preservation of the outstanding wilderness at the heart of the Colorado Plateau. We thank you for providing the opportunity to present our views on the subcommittee's support for the Bureau of Land Management's financial involvement in the state of Utah's Watershed Restoration Initiative, a partnership that has resulted in tens of millions of federal taxpayer dollars spent on the destruction of native ecosystems throughout public lands in Utah. Specifically, we are concerned that the subcommittee's explicit support for this partnership greenlights BLM spending on large-scale removal of native vegetation, risks diverting limited agency monies away from critical staffing needs, and results in irreparable damage to Utah public lands. Utah's Watershed Restoration Initiative, which I'll refer to as the initiative, is founded and coordinated by the Utah State Department of Natural Resources. The initiative is a coalition of public and private entities created to fund and promote vegetation and habitat projects in Utah. The money pooling function of the initiative has undoubtedly produced a continual increase in vegetation removal on BLM-managed public lands in our state. In the report accompanying the appropriations bill for 2020, this subcommittee highlighted its concern over ongoing drought in the western United States and overtly endorsed BLM's continued funding of the initiative to, as the subcommittee stated, develop water resources to benefit the public, wildlife, endangered species, permittees, and other users. But vegetation removal projects, called vegetation treatments or habitat restoration, take many forms. Often, the initiative invests in projects that employ heavy machinery and extensive surface disturbance. One prevalent method is mastication, where a machine known as a bullhog is used to mulch vegetation, turning entire forests of live trees into thousands of acres of wood chips and stumps. Chaining utilizes a large anchor chain dragged between two enormous bulldozers to rip live trees out of the ground, roots and all. These chains, masticators, and other heavy equipment destroy the fragile living soil crust that is the backbone of the Colorado Plateau ecosystem and is our main defense against future drought and desertification. While preventing drought and fire and protecting watersheds are laudable goals for BLM, science tells us that the large-scale disturbance resulting from these projects can actually make these problems worse. BLM is spending millions of dollars a year on projects with no proven track record of success and with no real plan to develop the science necessary to increase those odds in the future. Furthermore, the initiative's funding regime has created a tail-wagging-the-dog situation. As this pool of money has grown, so has the size and scale of vegetation removal projects proposed by BLM, regardless of science and research that recommends otherwise. Since 2006, BLM has contributed over $80 million in funding to support initiative projects in Utah. It is exceptionally difficult for the public to follow the trail of financing from congressional appropriation to BLM funding of initiative projects. We're concerned that discretionary agency monies are being moved away from other needs, such as filling critical BLM field office staffing vacancies in positions ranging from law enforcement officers to biologists, and is instead being transferred to a money-pooling coalition controlled by the state of Utah. Rather than protecting water resources, this taxpayer money is being used to fund the removal of native trees and shrubs, which results in a degraded ecosystem on public lands. Our concern over a lack of transparency is heightened when considering the revolving door between leadership at the Department of Interior and the state of Utah. We're not advocating that truly degraded ecosystems can never benefit from human help, but rather that the subcommittee should not continue to effectively grant BLM blanket approval to fund large-scale vegetation removal projects through this initiative partnership. We believe that additional appropriations oversight is necessary to ensure that BLM's funding pipeline for so-called watershed restoration projects is transparent, and that projects are grounded in high-quality science and monitoring, and that discretionary BLM funds are not being diverted from necessary staffing and resource needs toward initiative projects. We encourage the subcommittee to take a hard look at its endorsement of this partnership, issues of accountability both through BLM's funding process as well as when public funds are in the initiative's hands, and the initiative's continual promotion of projects that benefit economic interests at the detriment of all other resource values. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simpson.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, didn't push it hard enough.
stereo right here. Well, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name's Don Simpson. I'm the vice president of an organization called the Public Lands Foundation, or PLF. We're a national nonprofit organization. We're nearly all retired employees of the Bureau of Land Management and have a large body of experience, expertise, and knowledge of public land management. I'm here today to present our program priorities for the 2021 budget for BLM. The first program area is balanced energy development. I think we've had a little discussion already. We believe the subcommittee should support the environmentally responsible and balanced development of all energy resources. This includes oil, gas, coal, solar, wind, and geothermal. It also includes the associated pipeline and transmission infrastructure. It's critically important that sufficient funds are provided to not only support the leasing and permitting activities, but also the land use planning, the resource assessments, the NEPA reviews, the program management, and the inspection and enforcement activities. Sage-grouse habitat is the second issue that we have. As the West has become urbanized over the last 100 years, large areas of sagebrush have been impacted, resulting in significant sage-grouse population declines. The PLF recommends increased funding for the BLM to coordinate activities on public lands with state agencies, stakeholders, and partners to improve and restore habitat that has been damaged by wildfire, weed invasions, and development. Conserving and restoring habitat for sage-grouse will also enhance populations for elk, mule deer, golden eagles, and hundreds of sagebrush-dependent species. Wild horse and burros, number 3. So I'm going to tag on to what Ms. Kresko was talking about. The overpopulation of wild horses and burros on the range is now nearly 4 times its targeted management level. And it's past a critical point, and it's doing irreparable harm to the land, the vegetation, the wildlife, and the animals themselves. The PLF has been working as a partner with a broad coalition of diverse stakeholders that are seeking a solution to the problem. The only viable approach for resolution is the implementation of a consistently funded multi-year strategy that entails aggressive removals, broad-scale annual application of fertility control, novel efforts to increase adoption, such as BLM's recent incentive program, and pasturing of unadopted animals. We recommend that the committee, at a minimum, retain the 2020 funding level for the wild horse and burro program, with increases and long-term funding to implement the BLM's soon-to-be-presented plan. Recreation is the fourth area I'd like to discuss. For those of you that have visited the West recently, it's growing very rapidly. It's placing a significant demand on the public lands for recreation opportunities. In fiscal year 2018, the public lands provided 68 million recreation visits with an economic output of nearly $7 billion to the western states' economies. We recommend that the subcommittee increase funding for recreation, wildlife, fisheries, land restoration, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund. These funds will allow BLM to maintain and add recreation opportunities, secure easements for access to landlocked public lands, and restore degraded lands to improve wildlife and fisheries habitat. Fifth is an emerging and important program area, wildlife migration corridors. The BLM has been working for several years now with the state wildlife agencies to identify wildlife migration corridors for species such as mule deer, elk, and pronghorn antelope. Funding should be provided to continue and expand this effort. These are very small amounts of public lands, but they're crucial for these species to get to and from their winter and summer habitats. Our sixth and final issue I'd like to highlight is the functional elimination of the BLM headquarters. As you're aware, the Secretary of Interior announced the movement of the BLM headquarters of employees from Washington, D.C. to 11 western states. That was done last summer. So the director, assistant directors, and a few immediate staff are going to be located in Grand Junction, Colorado. The other staff will be scattered throughout other western locations. The PLF opposed this proposal as it will functionally eliminate the agency's headquarters. The result will be the largest federal land managing agency with no seat at the table in Washington, D.C., as policy, procedures, and budgets are developed. We strongly believe the BLM headquarters should be located in Washington, D.C. We recommend that funding be eliminated for the continuation of this action in fiscal year 2021 and that significant congressional oversight occur by both House and Senate appropriations and authorizing committees during fiscal year 2020. Thank you for the opportunity to share PLF's priorities.
Thank you so much. Mr. Augsbury.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, my name is Jim Augsbury. I'm the Executive Director of the Western Governors Association, a bipartisan organization representing the governors of the 22 westernmost states and territories. It is my profound honor to appear before you, particularly because of the disproportionate influence of the Interior Appropriations Bill on the economies and environments and quality of life in the great American West. Western governors have few priorities that are higher than that of strengthening the state-federal relationship. As the chief executives of co-sovereign governments, they aspire to work shoulder to shoulder with federal agencies as authentic partners in the development and execution of policy that affects our shared constituencies. States are not stakeholders, although they are too frequently treated as such by federal authorities. They are sovereigns, governed by men and women whose knowledge of their state's unique environments and economies and cultures should be integrated into federal policymaking. Federal consultation with states that is substantive, meaningful, and ongoing, and then occurs at the very earliest stages of a policy's ideation and throughout its execution, will result in policy that is more informed, durable, and defensible. This subcommittee in particular has consistently recognized the value of state engagement, directing that resource agencies within your jurisdiction utilize state science and data and analysis to inform federal decision-making. Western governors urge you to include such language in the report to accompany the fiscal year 2021 appropriations bill. The governors understand that you operate under severe fiscal constraints. Within those constraints, they respectfully urge your consideration of their priorities, which are outlined in detail in the written testimony that WEJ has submitted for the record. With respect to the conservation of the West's unparalleled natural resources, those priorities include funding to support the shared stewardship memorandum of understanding executed by Western governors with the Department of Agriculture, and additional funding to advance state-supported projects and programs promoting voluntary mitigation corridors and habitat conservation. Western governors appreciate the subcommittee's historic support of the Payment in Lieu of Taxes program. PILT funding does not represent a gift to Western states. Rather, it helps compensate Western jurisdictions for the disproportionate measure of non-taxable federal lands within the region. WEGA encourages you to continue full funding of PILT and the Secure Rural Schools program in the coming fiscal year. I commend your attention to my written testimony for a discussion of other gubernatorial priorities, including protection of state authority over water and groundwater, funding to address the maintenance backlog at national parks, efforts to combat invasive species, and funding to help states comply with their obligations under the Clean Water Act. In the meantime, thank you again for the opportunity to testify. Western governors appreciate the enormity of your responsibilities and urge that you regard them as partners and resources as you establish funding priorities for the nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you to all of you for the great work that you're doing. Ms. Kraska, I know that's an intractable problem, and appreciate the hard work that your organization is doing. Ms. Marienfield, I'm coming from an eastern state, so unaware of some of the things that happen in western states, and I guess and I'll certainly get up to speed and learn a little more about this, but I guess I'm not completely clear what the original purpose is of deforesting and these vegetation, I forgot what you termed them as, but anyway, what's the stated purpose of doing that?
It varies from project to project. Oftentimes you get sort of a catch-all where it's wildlife restoration, habitat, sage grouse protection is one, watershed protection. Grazing is really heavily involved in these projects as well. It's never a stated benefit more often than not these days, but it's often an auxiliary benefit of the treatments when they happen. And then more recently, you're seeing fire prevention as a stated reason for doing these treatments in the West as well.
So when you deforest land, does prairie grass or something grow up there so it can become grazing lands? Is that what
In the West, more often than not, it has to be really heavily impacted, heavily treated in order for that to happen. There are a lot of factors that go into perennial grasses or forbs coming back. You'll see land management agencies that seed there. They often seed non-native species that are good for cattle forage as part of these projects. But it's really dependent on weather and climate conditions, whether or not the treatments are successful at the end of the day, which is why you do see, according to the best science and the research that's out there right now, that the treatments really are unsuccessful by most metrics a lot of the time if they are in those very heavily surface disturbing manners, the big mechanical treatments that we're talking about here. It depends on the weather. If you get rain, maybe it'll work, but if you don't, which is far more common these days, they're unsuccessful and you have to go back and do basically the same thing about 10 years later.
Well, thank you. I'm sure I'll be interested to learn more about that.
Thank you.
Mr. Simpson, I too am very concerned about this relocation of and the reorganization of the Bureau of Land Management. I also sit on agricultural appropriations, so we've been very discouraged to watch the relocation of ARS NIFA, and can see that that's just had disastrous consequences. A lot of senior staff was lost in the process, so a lot of the experience and brain trust there, and didn't seem to be a lot of consultation. So I'm just curious, from your perspective, the administration maintained that it conducted extensive consultation with Bureau employees, especially senior employees, before implementing this breakup. Can you tell us what you're hearing from members of your organization regarding that claim?
Sure. So we have about 600 members, and they're scattered throughout the country. So they're near a BLM office somewhere in the West. We do a lot of work with them, public lands appreciation days, that kind of stuff. So we're in daily contact pretty much with our BLM offices. And I have to say, when that was announced last summer, none of the BLM people that we had talked to knew this was coming. They read about it the same time we did.
Yeah, that's very discouraging. And again, we have lots of concerns about this. And hopefully, in my opinion, the committee can exercise more oversight on this process. And thank you, too, Mr. Augsburry. I appreciate your representation of the Western State Governors. Mr. Joyce?
Thank you all for being here. I can appreciate the problems that you certainly have in those issues. It's something we've studied, and the combination of the animals in the land and trying to find where we have that perfect match. And I know the answers aren't easy, but we'll continue to work with you to try to address those concerns. Thank you for coming.
Thank you to this panel. This concludes the morning hearing, and we stand adjourned until the afternoon hearing begins at 1 p.m. Thanks again very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Nice to see you. Good job. Likewise to you. Yeah, we saw that we have a liaison with NRCS. I don't know why we don't have one with BLM. Probably be productive.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you would.
Yeah.
You're in Denver, right?
You bet. You bet. And where are you located?
I'm in Fort Collins.
Okay. Just right down the road.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I was visiting.